To mark up the fiscal 016 Interior and Environment Appropriations Bill. We're going to turn now to Chairman Calvert. This is his maiden voyage on this bill, and we look forward to setting sail with him. So, Chairman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to well, hey. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin this morning by thanking Chairman Rogers for his support and leadership. I also want to thank my good friend and ranking member, Ms. McCollum, for her partnership and work on this bill. Finally, I want to thank each of the subcommittee members for their efforts and their friendship. It continues to be a hallmark of our subcommittee's deliberations. And finally, I want to thank our fine staff on both sides who worked countless hours to put this bill together. We're certainly grateful to them. The fiscal year 2016 Interior Environment Bill is funded at $30.17 billion, which is $246 million below the fiscal year 2015 enacted level and $3 billion below the budget request. We've made a sincere effort to prioritize our needs within our 302B allocation. The committee has again provided robust wildland fire funding in fiscal year 2016. Fire suppression accounts, including the Flame Reserve Fund, are again fully funded for the 10-year average level. The bill also makes critical investments in Indian country. Overall funding for the Indian Health Service is increased by $145 million, or 3%, while funding for the Bureaus of Indian Affairs and Education is increased by $165 million, or 6%, from fiscal year 2015 levels, the largest percentage increase in this bill. The bill provides full funding for fiscal year 2016 for payments in lieu of taxes, or the PILT program. The bill provides $2.7 billion for the National Park Service, including more than $60 million in new funding relating to the centennial of the Park Service. We've also attempted to address a number of priorities within the Fish and Wildlife Service accounts. The bill funds popular grant programs at slightly above fiscal year 2015 enacted levels. It also provides additional funds to combat international wildlife trafficking, protects fish hatcheries from cuts and closures, continues funding to fight invasive species, and reduces the backload of species that are recovered but not yet delisted. The bill provides $248 million for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, programs that enjoy broad bipartisan support. We've attempted to return the emphasis of the Land and Water Conservation Fund to its original intent of recreation, state, and local acquisitions. Overall, funding for EPA is reduced by $718 million, or 9%, from fiscal year 2015 enacted level. Again, this year, there is a great deal of concern over the number of regulatory actions being pursued by EPA in the absence of legislation and without clear congressional direction. For this reason, the bill includes a number of provisions to stop unnecessary and damaging regulatory overreach by the agency. Before closing, I'd like to make one further point about several Endangered Species Act provisions in this bill. We have no interest in interfering with science and no interest in letting any species go extinct. But we are concerned about federal regulatory actions lacking in basic fairness and common sense, and the continued use of the judicial system to make land management decisions. Nowhere is this more evident than with the sage grouse. States are rightfully concerned that the listing or unnecessary restrictive federal land use plans will jeopardize existing conservation partnerships with states and private landowners. These partnerships are necessary to save both the sagebrush ecosystem and local economies. So as long as the sage grouse are not in imminent threat of extinction, cooperative conservation must be given a chance to work. That is why this bill maintains a one-year delay on any decision to list sage grouse, along with full funding to implement conservation efforts. In closing, again, I'd like to thank the staff on both sides of the aisle who have worked hard on this legislation before us today. This markup is the next step in a long process, and I hope over the coming months we'll come together as we do each year to find common ground. In that spirit, I look forward to continuing to work with Ms. McCollum and the members of the committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The chair wishes to state that for only the second time in his life he made a mistake. This is not the chairman's first, this is not his maiden voyage, it's his second trip around the world, so thank you, Mr. Chairman. We recognize the new ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. McCollum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Chairman Calvert. I'd like to thank the chair as well for this opportunity to be part of a large group that does a lot, that tries to do a lot of good for the American people. And to Ranking Member Lowy, thank you for your mentorship. I want to begin by complimenting our chairman, Chairman Calvert, for the sincere and collaborative manner in which he has carried out his duties while laboring under an inadequate allocation. Chairman Calvert chaired 14 budget hearings where we received testimony from nearly 150 witnesses. I greatly appreciate the chairman's willingness to hear from so many agencies and citizen voices. And what made that possible was the staff. So let me express my appreciation to subcommittee staff on the minority and the majority sides for their hard work during another difficult budget year. Thank you all. However, and unfortunately, the inadequate 302B allocation given to the Interior Subcommittee has set this bill up for failure. The committee's 302B allocation for FY 2016 is $246 million below the FY 15 enacted level. When added with the cuts over the past 5 years, the bill before us today is more than $2 billion below FY 2010 enacted levels. In fact, when adjusted for inflation, this bill invests less than what was appropriated in 2005. It's time to dispel the notion that these budget cuts have only resulted in a little belt-tightening. Years of cuts and flat funding mean we are going backwards and causing real harm to the environment, undermining efforts to preserve America's natural and cultural heritage. And we are unable to meet our commitments to the social and economic well-being of Native Americans. Members of this subcommittee spent 2 full days listening to testimony from tribal leaders and other Native American community. We heard compelling testimony of the unmet needs in Indian country, especially in the areas of education and health. Whether it's health, education, or economic status, Native Americans rank below every other group of Americans in the level of benefits they receive. Yet because of this bill's unfortunate inadequate allocation, many Native American programs unfortunately receive far less funding than requested, or I believe what we as a subcommittee, combined, nonpartisan, would have liked to have seen happen. Our bipartisan shared goal is to meet the needs of Indian country, and we just could not do this with this allocation. Last year, and attendance of our national parks was at a record high. Attendance at our national parks was a record high. And what happens in 2016? Well, it's the centennial of the National Park Service, and visitation is expected to increase. But what will visitors find when they come to our national parks in 2016 for the centennial celebration? Well, they're going to find buildings in disrepair, trails in disrepair, and less opportunities to have a full ranger experience. These outdated facilities and unstate roads and closed campsites and empty ranger stations, that's not the way to celebrate America's national treasures. Under this bill, less than 16% of the funds requested by the National Park Centennial are provided. By underfunding the Centennial Challenge, this bill misses an opportunity to allow average, hardworking Americans to support their parks through a matching donation. The National Park Civil Rights Initiative fares only slightly better with just 19% of the requested funds. This pattern of shortchanging our conservation of our nation is continued in the Land and Water Conservation Fund program, where funding, unfortunately, is cut more than 25% below FY 2015 enacted level. Wildlife programs are underfunded, and with cuts or flat funding to programs that assist the recovery of species or help prevent their delisting in the first place. I'm especially troubled by the majority's decision to cut the Endangered Species Act listing program by 50%. By slashing funding for these endangered species programs, the bill ensures that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife will fail to make listing determinations within the mandatory time frame. Then, such delays will be used as fodder to undermine this landmark environmental law. However, the most significant and devastating cuts, again, are targeted at the Environmental Protection Agency. This bill cuts the EPA by $718 million from the 2015 enacted level. That's a 9% cut. But this would be on top of a nearly 20% cut the agency has received over the past 4 years. The air every American breathes, the water every American family drinks, are at risk because of the funding cuts and policy attacks in this bill. The consequences of abandoning public health and environmental protection will be negatively felt in communities across this nation. This bill cuts the Clean Water and Safe Drinking Water revolving funds by more than $500 million. The revolving funds are a partnership that protects America's drinking water, prevents sewage from contaminating our waters, and creates jobs in communities all across this country. Slashing state revolving funds means the local communities have to choose between risking public health or raising taxes to fill the hole that this bill creates by not doing our federal obligation. Wildlife fires burn up 12%, or $3.5 billion of this subcommittee's allocation. Without some relief, these numbers will only continue to grow. Just last week, the Secretaries of Agriculture and Interior released their latest summer forecast, which showed fire costs are likely to exceed the FY 2015 enacted level by nearly $300 million. In just the past 3 years, we've had to make up a total of $1 billion funding shortfall that forced agencies to borrow funds from other accounts to pay for fire costs. Now, we do know the answer to this problem, and many of us are co-sponsors with Mr. Simpson on his bill to treat a portion of these wildfire costs as a disaster they are. And if you're not a co-sponsor now, please join Mr. Simpson. As problematically as these funding decisions in this bill are, what's even more troubling is the 24 problem legislative riders and funding limitations contained in this bill, 6 of which are new this year. These provisions do not belong in the bill. They only serve to undermine our nation's bedrock environmental laws, endanger public health and safety, and deny the impact that climate change is having on our planet. Mr. Chairman, we heard the testimony. We know the needs. Congress needs to get serious about fixing the Budget Control Act's irresponsible caps, and the sooner the better. And as it stands, the numbers and the riders in this Interior bill are not workable or sustainable, so they do not have my support. But I intend to continue to work with you, Chairman Calvert, to improve this bill in the hope that at the end of this process, we will have a legislative product that will have full bipartisan support. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And the ranking member for thoughtful comments and hard work, of course, on the bill. Bill totals $30.17 billion, supporting important Department of Interior and Environment programs that protect and promote our natural resources within a responsible, sustainable budget. The bill also preserves the role of the federal government, making sure that the government is doing its job well, while ensuring that it's not harmful or intrusive into the lives of the American people or our economy. The bill makes great strides to budget responsibly, investing in proven programs like cuts where we can, EPA being one agency that can certainly make do with less. The bill reduces funding for the EPA by $718 million, 9% below last year, encouraging the agency to streamline its operations and focus on its core duties rather than meddling in an unnecessary, job-killing regulatory agenda. This administration has been hell-bent on implementing all sorts of regulations that are harmful to both our economy and our energy security, seemingly without concern for the thousands of hardworking Americans who might lose their jobs or see more and more of their paychecks. Nowhere is this more evident than in my district and coal mining communities throughout the nation. So bill-wide, we've included several important policy provisions aimed to stop this sort of overzealous, overreaching bureaucratic red tape. For instance, the bill prohibits the EPA from changing the definitions of, quote, navigable waters, quote, and, quote, fill material, quote, and prevents them from implementing new over-the-top greenhouse gas regulations for power plants. The bill also prevents increased oil and gas inspection fees and grazing fees. We must do whatever we can to keep the government from inhibiting economic growth by over-regulating and overtaxing American business and industry, and this appropriations bill is a great place to start. Again, I want to thank the chairman, ranking member, for bringing this bill forward before the committee, and thank the entire subcommittee for their work putting this bill together, and staff, of course. So I urge that we support this bill today. Let me now turn to the ranking member for the full committee, Ms. Lowy, for any comments she might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd also like to thank Chairman Calvert and Chairwoman Betty McCollum for their cooperative efforts on this bill, and this is your first full committee markup as ranking member, so congratulations. And I also want to thank the hardworking staff. And while I appreciate the chairman's willingness to accommodate some Democratic priorities, this is the latest in a series of bills that drastically shortchanges job-creating investments and vital environmental protections while carrying a wish list of special interest giveaways that hurt hardworking American families' health and safety. The president proposed to end sequestration through more reasonable and realistic budgeting 4 months ago. But unfortunately, the Republicans have yet to engage in finding a workable solution. My friends, how much longer do we have to play this charade before the committee writes bills that could be enacted? It really is time to end the sequester and move forward now. Refusing to adopt a sufficient overall allocation for discretionary investments has led to a bill that severely underfunds far too many priorities. The EPA would be slashed $1.17 billion below the president's request, $718 million below the 2015 enacted level. Such a draconian cut would take EPA investments back to 1997 levels. Capital programs are dramatically underfunded, with Indian health facilities receiving $173 million less than the president's request. Over $500 million in cuts to the state revolving funds endanger our nation's water infrastructure, cutting 32,000 construction jobs on 207 projects, risking public health with fewer water and drinking water projects. The Land and Water Conservation Fund, which conserves irreplaceable lands and improves outdoor recreation opportunities, would be cut by 30% below the current level. And, unsurprisingly, the majority seeks to dismantle critical environmental protections in the bill that are supposed to advance environmental initiatives. In a demonstration of solidarity with climate change deniers and the coal industry, the majority would prevent the administration from advancing new rules to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Despite the fact that it harmonizes existing activities to protect the environment, 2.8 million ocean industry jobs, and $282 billion in GDP generated by ocean industries and coastal states, the National Ocean Policy's implementation would be blocked. Once again, the majority has waged war on the Endangered Species Act, placing politics above science and jeopardizing the protection of precious species. Instead of allowing the United States to lead the world to end the trade of ivory, the Fish and Wildlife Service's efforts would be rolled back. Given the number of unnecessary riders, it is particularly disappointing that the majority didn't include our colleague Mr. Simpson's Wildfire bill, an excellent proposal that would improve our ability to prepare for and respond to disasters. Democrats are more than willing to support bills that include adequate spending levels to grow our economy and that are absent of problematic and unnecessary riders. And I really do hope, my colleagues, my friends, that as we move forward, this bill makes those investments and sheds misguided policy changes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further discussion? Mr. Young?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a great historic landmark in my district, the Fort Des Moines, and I had considered offering an amendment regarding this, the oversight, responsibility, and management of it with the National Park Service. I will not be offering the amendment. I've been working with committee staff and the chairman. Thank you, Chairman Calvert. And I'm pretty sure we can find a solution to this issue, and so I would just want to thank the chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to note that the bill contains increased funding. The gentleman from Iowa, for his comments, the gentleman is correct that we are able to provide additional funds for historic preservation in this bill. I'd be more than happy to raise any specific concerns that you have with the leadership of the National Park Service, and I look forward to continue to working with you on issues concerning you and to your constituents back home.
Mr. Farr?
Mr. Chairman, I rise because I think these budget cuts that we're adopting are just the opposite of responsible and sustainable. Just in the Forest Service alone, what's happening, and I have a lot of fire in California, and I used to be a wildland firefighter for the U.S. Forest Service. What's happening on the ground is that the local governments, county fire agencies and state fire agencies are giving wages and benefits far exceeding that of the federal government. And when you report to a fire, all of these agencies are responders, first responders. But the firefighters know that the people working alongside them from state and local governments are getting a lot better benefits. And they're leaving. They're leaving. Senator Feinstein had to put in an amendment in the fire season a couple of years ago just to give firefighters a boost because all our top management people were going to go work, particularly in California, for the state or for local governments. That's not responsible, and that's not sustainable. I think if you look at the provisions in this bill that prohibit the administration from doing so many things, these aren't things that our local governments are against or state governments. Prohibiting the EPA from ensuring mining companies are financially capable of cleaning up the pollution that operations cause to land and water. Well, you think the neighborhood wants those companies to get off from doing that? Prohibiting the EPA from changing the way discharge or fill material is regulated? Prohibiting the EPA from finalizing proposed regulations clarifying the federal jurisdiction of navigable waters under the Clean Water Act? Prohibiting the EPA from enforcing a rule for safe removal and renovation of lead paint? Prohibiting the funding for the development or revisions of regulations regarding imported ivory? Those aren't things that our And you know what happens? Those local governments and state governments adopt laws to do just the opposite. This bill is an Environmental Defense Fund, a Guaranteed Employment Act, because you're not changing the law. It's there. You're prohibiting them from having workers deal with it. So you get a backlog, and people need permits. They can't get the permits, and they end up hiring a lawyer and suing the federal government. Now, we got a lot of money to pay for lawyers, but it also, there's a cost on the other end. And I just saw in this last election the most enthusiastic turnout in a small, tiny county was to an initiative to ban fracking. It passed overwhelmingly, despite in a tiny, tiny county with 55,000 people, the oil company spent $5 million against it. And the people won. And that's what's going on. They're taking the law into their hands because we're failing to do it. So to think that cut, squeeze, and trim is responsible and sustainable, I'll argue that it's not. We've got to lift this crazy sequestration act. We invented it. We got to uninvent it.
Mr. Dent?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to mention something. I have some serious concerns that the Bureau of Land Management is failing to comply with the Helium Stewardship Act of 2013 by proposing a prioritized delivery system for crude helium from the Federal Helium Reserve. It's a law that we all worked on and very proud to support, but this HSA sets forth parameters meant to ensure that federal users and only federal users receive priority access to the reserve. It specifies that BLM should ensure timely delivery for crude helium sold at auction and allocated sale. We all agree that in the event of a shortage, federal users should still be guaranteed unrestricted access to the Federal Helium Reserve. However, if helium delivery requests for non-federal users must be prorated, then they must be prorated on an equivalent basis regardless the type of owner or the date of purchase. And by preferencing some private users over others, BLM is failing to abide by the clear congressional intent of the Helium Act. Mr. Chairman, this issue is about fairness, is about protecting contract rights, property rights, and really it's BLM is not behaving in a way that I think is consistent with what we in Congress wanted to have happen. We have oversight as appropriators. I'm not going to offer an amendment because I think there's a better way to deal with this through the authorization process, but I certainly would like to thank you and the subcommittee staff for working with my office on this, and look forward to working with you further. So you, Mr. Chairman, and some of the authorizers, so we can get to a better place on this very important issue.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania raising this issue for his attention to the management of the nation's helium reserve. Helium's not just for birthday party balloons, as you know. It's vitally important to many industries, and as you know, we wouldn't have a space industry without it. So I understand the concerns of how the Bureau is implementing the Helium Stewardship Act of 2013. Like you, I pay close attention to how the executive branch agencies implement laws that Congress passes. And I understand the Resource Committee intends to hold hearings in July, perhaps develop legislation in the near future. I look forward to working with the gentleman and raising this issue today.
Mr. Cole?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just rise to thank the chairman and the ranking member for their hard work on Native American issues in this particular bill. Now, for 4 years in a row, this committee has actually put more money in Indian health and the BIA than the Obama administration requested. And I say that with no disrespect to the Obama administration. It's been an excellent administration on Native American affairs. But this committee has actually gone further. This year, the president finally won the prize, and he proposed a little bit more than we can do. But I think it's important for the committee to know that this bill still continues to build on the progress. 3% increase in Native American, in the Indian Health Service, 6% increase in the BIA, and frankly, it's the largest increase in any area in this budget. So from a Native American standpoint, I just want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, you and, of course, your predecessor, Mr. Simpson, have done a good job, but that's always been in cooperation with our friends on the other side of the aisle who also have the same sense of priorities here. I will tell you, long-term on this issue, incremental and steady progress is more important than 1 year's show, and this committee has really lined up and done it. So whatever our differences on other issues, the cooperation, which again, Mr. Chairman, you were part of as a member and now lead as the chairman, is really something we should all collectively be proud of, because this is one where our entire committee has set the standard compared to our friends on the other side of the rotunda, or even our friend at the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue. Good job, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there further general discussion? If not, are there amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Chairman, clerk,
I would ask that the clerk dispense with
Offered by Mr.
Without
Calvert.
objection, reading is dispensed with.
Mr. Chairman, I have a manager's amendment making a number of changes in the bill and report that that are interest to the bipartisan members of the committee. Ms. McCollum and I have worked closely in putting together this amendment, and we are in agreement. And I urge the adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Ms. McCollum?
Mr. Chair, I rise in support of the manager's amendment, and I thank the gentleman for his cooperation in making it truly bipartisan.
Mr. Cuellar?
Chairman, I also want to thank the chairman and the ranking woman. There's one particular provision that got added that I think it's personal to me, and that is the provision where we recognize the importance of agricultural worker protection standards, especially for the migrant farm workers, for the children who work on farms dealing with the pesticides. My father and my mother were migrant workers that took me to Utah, Colorado, and a couple of the places when I was younger. And working with the this provision will allow us to work with the Department of Agriculture, farmers, and farm workers and other folks where we can set certain standards. Standards, for example, for the first time ever, have a minimum age requirement where children under the age of 16 will be prohibited from handling pesticides, which is something very important. Imagine our kids working out on the farms and dealing with those pesticides. There's other provisions that I think we're working. So again, on behalf of all those children, especially under the age of 16, and of course the farm workers, the migrant workers, I do want to thank the chairman and the ranking member. This is very important. Thank you so much. I support the manager's amendment.
Further discussion of the amendment? Hearing none. The question is on the manager's amendment by the chairman. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Ms. McCollum?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk, and I would like to take up McCollum 1, please.
Which amendment?
It should
Number
be
1?
Yes, sir.
Clerk will
Number
read.
1.
Amendment offered by Ms. McCollum, page 35.
I would like it to be
Without
considered as read
objection,
with, thank you,
The
sir.
reading is dispensed with.
This amendment would strike 24 of the most egregious legislative writers and funding limitations from this bill. Mr. Chairman, I'm under no illusion that appropriation bills are free of legislative text. However, this bill goes too far and includes veto bait provisions that seek to turn back protections on endangered species, restrict control of greenhouse gas emissions, and undermine clean water and clean air provisions. And this is a story that's been repeated year after year. Numerous special provisions have been tucked away in this bill, but this is the most we've seen, and 5 of them are, quite frankly, brand new to this bill. It appears today that there will be even further attempts with amendments to weigh the bill down with additional funding limitations. Many of these provisions in one form or another have been considered in the House as standalone measures. While these standalone measures failed to be enacted into law, their supporters and sponsors have turned our committee into the group of people that are going to carry their load. So, folks, when we start doing the work of the authorizing committees, we not only take on policy discussions that divide us from doing our work, but we also add to the gridlock. So we need to stop and return this appropriations bill back from becoming the grab bag that it has been of legislative treats for special interests, repealing environmental regulations that don't create jobs or save money, but it costs jobs and it costs money. I just ask the residents of communities that have borne the brunt of environmental disasters, are jobs hard enough with declining funding levels for agencies under our jurisdiction? And will only be successful in bringing appropriation bills into enactment if this committee has the courage to resist the external pressures to bring these extraneous and contentious legislative matters to funding this bill. So I would urge adoption of my amendment.
Chairman Calvert?
Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong opposition to the gentlelady's amendment. This administration's appetite for new regulations and disregard for the will of Congress have left us with little choice but to block the President's overzealous regulatory agenda in this bill. I'm confident that our entire Republican conference understands both the danger of allowing the President to circumvent Congress and the devastating consequences to our economy and job creation if these rules and regulations are approved. The actions we've taken to address EPA's overreach and to reduce its budget not only help us meet the tight spending constraints under which we're operating, they help our struggling economy and encourage job creators to invest and expand. That's why we've included these provisions in the bill, and that's why the language needs to stay in the bill. So I strongly would urge a no vote on the amendment to strike the language. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is there further discussion? Ms. Lowy?
I rise in strong support of Ranking Member McCollum's amendment. We've been down this path before. It was only 6 months ago that Chairman Rogers and I worked with our Senate counterparts to negotiate an omnibus that could be signed by the President. There were many more than a few times during those talks where I doubted we would make it. But we eventually passed an omnibus covering 11 of the 12 annual spending bills. Everyone gave up something. Most notably, nearly all of the controversial policy riders that had been included were dropped from the final package. There was an acknowledgement that these provisions imperiled everything we were working on. A must-pass spending bill wasn't the place to undertake serious amendments to existing laws that in most instances were not under our jurisdiction. Clearly, there are already distinct differences associated with many of the funding decisions in this bill. If the Democrats were writing this bill, we would make different funding decisions. And this is exactly why we should support Ms. McCollum's amendment. We already have our work cut out for us on the job we are supposed to be doing, determining funding levels. My colleagues, we should not allow this process to be bogged down by controversial riders. We must vote to drop them now. Thank you.
Further discussion? Ms. Wasserman-Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the amendment offered by the ranking member, Ms. McCollum, as well as all the amendments that will be offered by my colleagues to strike these dangerous EPA policy riders. And I'm deeply disappointed that this bill doubles down on last year's appropriations bill that was full of short-sighted policy riders. The bill this year seems to have even more of those. Riders that eviscerate efforts to protect our nation's precious environmental resources. There is simply no place for these kinds of riders that are related to policy in a funding bill. I'm also not naive, but I think we need to stress that this kind of radical policy change is not appropriate in an appropriations bill. Let's be clear about something. The bill before us today is the funding vehicle for two critically important federal agencies, the Department of the Interior and the Environmental Protection Agency. These agencies were created by Congress to protect America's natural resources and heritage, to ensure viable energy resources, and to ensure that our human activities are conducted in a sustainable way that ensures our clean air, clean water, and that we have a healthy environment for us, for our children, and for all future generations. We should let them do this vital work, not create new roadblocks for them. These agencies have a very difficult job. They constantly must balance numerous competing interests and do so while working with international, state, and local partners. We in Congress may not always agree on the exact approach by which these agencies carry out their mission, and that's fine, but it's our job to help shape those priorities through our funding levels. But what we should not do is attempt to stand in the place of these expert agencies by stopping them from acting within the scope of their statutory discretion. While my Democratic colleagues have shared a laundry list of inappropriate policy riders, which I agree should all be removed, I want to focus on 4 quickly in particular. First, this bill includes a policy rider that blocks the administration's national ocean policy. As I noted last year on this very issue, the national ocean policy simply builds on years of bipartisan federal, state, local cooperation, improves the cooperation and coordination among resource users, and develops plans to strengthen our $5.6 trillion coastal and ocean economic engine. The rider language currently in the bill will actually hurt many of the coastal communities that rely on a healthy, well-managed ocean ecosystem to drive their economies. It will deprive state and local governments of the federal coordination, expertise, and resources that will help us all better manage our ocean resources so they will be sustainable for generations to come. The coordination and assistance is critically important to states like my home state of Florida, with over 1,300 miles of coastlines and many competing uses of ocean resources, including commercial and recreational fishing, a vibrant shipping industry, urban development of the coast, and a strong tourism industry that relies on healthy ocean ecosystems. Second, this bill includes a policy rider that blocks the EPA from implementing and enforcing its new final rule, clarifying the federal jurisdiction of navigable waters under the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act was passed by Congress to ensure that we root out pollution from our waterways. Third, I'm disappointed that this bill includes a policy rider to prohibit the Fish and Wildlife Service from revising its regulations to better combat the trade and importation of ivory. And finally, just if I can ask for another minute, Mr. Chairman. Finally, I believe I'm probably the only other member to be speaking on this. Thank you. Finally, I strongly oppose the multiple riders aimed at tying agency actions to combat climate change. You can stick your head in the sand all you want on this issue, but as I've heard, and we've all heard scientists say before, the great thing about facts is that they're true, whether or not you believe in them. And my congressional district is the world's #1 most endangered urban area when it comes to climate change. As I stated here last week, a recent Miami Herald story noted that sea levels could rise by as much as 6 feet by 2100. 6 feet. This is no joking matter. If you keep your head in the sand long enough, you just might drown. While Congress fiddles, local communities are acting and we should be helping them. In my own district, cities like Miami Beach are working on plans, and we need to make sure that we can empower those plans, not stand in their way. Thank you. I yield
Is there
back.
further discussion? If not, Ms. McCollum's recognized to close. Mike.
When we start doing the work of the authorizing committees, we not only take on the policy discussions, but we take on the gridlock. And quite frankly, our job is hard enough with declining funding levels for agencies under our jurisdiction. So I would encourage support of the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Question is on the McCollum amendment. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, say no. No. Noes have it. The recorded votes requested. Sufficient support is shown. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderhold? Mr. Adderhold, no. Mr. Amadei? Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert? No. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw? Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar? Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson? Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro? Aye. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent? Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr? Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fattah? Mr. Fattah, aye. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen? Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger? Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler? Ms. Herrera-Butler, no. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Israel? Aye. Mr. Israel, aye. Mr. Jenkins? Mr. Jenkins, no. Mr. Jolly? Mr. Jolly, no. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter? Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer? Aye. Mr. Kilmer, aye. Ms. Lee? Aye. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy? Aye. Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCollum? Aye. Ms. McCollum, aye. Mr. Palazzo? Mr. Palazzo, no. Ms. Pingree? Aye. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price? Aye. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Aye. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mr. Ridgel? Mr. Ridgel, no. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo-Allard? Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Rupersberger? Mr. Rupersberger, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Viscoski? Mr. Viscoski, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, no.
Or change their vote? Clerk will tally. we're waiting for the tally, the clerk wishes to inquire of the gentleman, Mr. Amadei, what happened to the contents of these?
You, Mr. Chairman, for your kind shout-out. That makes it bipartisan that the members of this committee can't just simply say, thank you for a nice memento of the lake that's in California and Nevada. The question came up before we distributed them, and I thought it would be better to be honest, because if there was water in them, I'm sure there would be a bipartisan move to, well, is this water really from Lake Tahoe? And so, in the future, when we endeavor to provide something from the Silver State that should be filled, we will make sure that it's authentic. So I apologize for the DC atmosphere that is in these bottles, and it will never happen again. And by the way, you're all welcome.
There we go. There we go. On this vote, the yeas are 19, the nays are 32. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there other amendments? Ms. McCollum?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, McCollum 2.
Clerk will read.
Mr.
Amendment by
Chairman,
Alfred, Ms. McCollum.
if it, I
Without
would-
objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, before we do that, I did not distribute empty candy wrappers. So enjoy the calories at your own expense of a U.S.-made candy bar from the 4th District. Mr. Chairman, the bill before us includes $3.5 billion to the fund that is expected for FY 2016 wildland fire costs. If past experiences is any guide, that funding allocation will soon be out of date. Just last week, the Secretaries of Agriculture and Interior provided their latest 2015 summer fire forecast that includes a new estimate of $291 million shortfall. That's a $291 million shortfall in FY 2015 fire costs. So we're facing a $291 million shortfall even after we appropriate a combined $3.9 billion for wildland fire in 2015. We need some relief from these ever-escalating fire costs that are taking a larger and larger share of the Interior and Environment's allocation. And that's why I'm proposing to fund part of the FY 2016 wildland fire budget under the disaster relief budget cap as requested by the administration and unders. A funding portion of wildland fire under the disaster relief budget cap is supported by a large and diverse coalition, which includes members of the forestry products industry, professional foresters, and environmental organizations. It is not easy to bring together a coalition on any forestry matter, but the fact that they have come together on a fire funding issue is a testament to its importance and a testament to Mr. Simpson. Providing for a portion of wildland fire to be funded under the disaster relief cap complements the proposal of my colleague that I mentioned earlier from Idaho. Mr. Simpson's legislation, H.R. 167, like my amendment, treats the largest wildfires as the disasters they really are. These fires, which comprise 1% of the total number of fires, consumes 30% of wildfire costs. The Simpson bill would also fund these large fires through existing fire disaster budget cap, providing relief from escalating wildland fire costs that we are facing. I and many other members of this committee on both sides of the aisle, as I mentioned earlier, are co-sponsors of the Simpson legislation. It's been endorsed by the administration and many of the national groups that deal with fire issues. For far too long, we've talked about fixing this problem. Now the time has come to act. My amendment also has the added benefit of freeing up $407 million to spend on other important programs in this bill. Mr. Chairman, if this amendment was to be adopted, we can put the clean water and safe drinking water infrastructure programs back to the FY 2015 enacted level. My amendment would add $250 million to the Clean Water Fund and $157 million to the Safe Drinking Water Fund. Without this amendment, this bill will cut the Clean Water Fund by nearly 30% and the Safe Drinking Water Fund by nearly 17%. Without investments like the ones in our clean, safe clean water and safe water, drinking water, we shortchange our communities, we hurt our environment, and we forego an opportunity to put hard-working Americans to work to protect public health. We need to address this problem with wildland fire costs and take care of our infrastructure needs. So with that, I would urge adoption of this amendment.
Chairman Calvert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Although I understand and appreciate the intent of the gentlelady's amendment, I must rise to oppose it. The amendment would adopt the President's proposal to allow 30% of the cost of fighting the most catastrophic fires to be covered through the Disaster Relief Fund. Most of us agree to that change as the way we budget forest fires. In fact, 24 members of this committee are co-sponsors of our colleague, Rep. Simpson, who's getting a lot of praise here today. I'm sure he's enjoying that. Of H.R. 167 to make the change. However, it's not in our jurisdiction to do so. We need the budget committees to make the adjustment. There seems to be a misconception that the change in budgeting for catastrophic wildfires would increase federal spending. This is 100% inaccurate. We do cover the cost. In fact, in this bill, we provide full funding at the 10-year average for the wildland fire accounts. The problem is the budget structure, not the spending. Instead of either providing the full amount needed for firefighting at the beginning of the fiscal year or covering the costs through a supplemental appropriations package, we allow the Forest Service and the Department of Interior to use funds appropriated for other purposes to fight fires. While this may seem convenient in the short term, it only hurts us as hazardous fuel reduction and other forest management projects are put on hold for months or even years at a time. As such, efforts to improve forest fires are hindered because we take away the funds needed for it in order to cover the costs when the forests burn. Again, while I oppose the gentlelady's amendment, I look forward to working with her and other members of this committee to find an ultimate solution to this problem.
Is there further discussion? If not, Ms. Pingree.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to rise in support of this McCollum amendment. And since I haven't been up before, I do want to just start by thanking the chair and the ranking member. I'm fortunate enough to be on this committee, and I've really appreciated the opportunity to learn from both of you, the way you're able to work with so many of us on issues that are important to our constituents, and the assistance that you've given me and others. So thank you for that. I just wanted to say that I think the reason we're even talking about this, which the ranking member made clear, is there is not sufficient allocation in this bill to support the things that we care about. I know we all understand that we need to get rid of the sequester and roll back the BCA caps and pass these bills with funding levels that will move our country forward, not backward. We're stuck debating bills like this and opposing bills just because the dollars are simply not there. But this amendment today would help address this in regards to two particular programs that would bring essential dollars to the water and wastewater departments in all of our communities back home. In Maine, we have increasingly old water and wastewater infrastructure that's in need of repair, and I'm sure many of you are experiencing the same thing. Town and community leaders that I meet with are telling me about their needs repeatedly, and the problems are getting worse. My state certainly isn't unique, and I know we all know that we need to do something about this. With the cuts in the underlying bill to these EPA programs, there will be more needs that go unmet, more communities that are unable to maintain their quality of water, and more pressure on municipalities to make up the difference with dollars that they don't have either. I recognize completely the committee is in this position because of the caps, but these programs deserve more. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Chairman Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise, maybe not surprisingly, maybe surprisingly, in opposition to the amendment. I appreciate all the support for the bill that has been introduced in Congress and currently has 87 co-sponsors, 24 from this committee. I think it's a necessary step on what needs to be done to address wildfire fighting efforts. But you know, it seems like riders are kind of in the eye of the beholder. In the last amendment, what were considered riders were funding limitation amendments. That's totally appropriate for this committee. This is truly legislating on an appropriation bill, which is a little different. And so while I appreciate the support and the call out that various members gave during their opening statements, and I hope Congressman Lowy becomes a co-sponsor of this bill instead of just calling it out. But it is something that needs to be done. This is not the way to do it. We are continuing to work with both the Senate and other members from the Budget Committee and others to address this issue, which is a serious issue that I think needs to be done. And we will, I think, ultimately get this done because it is the right thing to do. Again, while I appreciate the support, this is the wrong way to do it. Last year, we had 140 co-sponsor this bill between Republicans and Democrats. And then it became a political issue when they did what do you call it? Discharge petition, when they filed a discharge petition. Then all of a sudden, all Republicans stopped signing on to the bill. So politically, that made it a little more difficult. And so we have 87 co-sponsors this year, and we hope to continue to do this. And I know Chairman Calvert is a very strong supporter of getting this done because it is the right thing to do. Again, this is the wrong way to do it. Thank you, Chairman.
Further discussion, Ms. Lowy?
Yes, and it must be an oversight, then I'll be the 88th co-sponsor of your bill. And thank you so very much. I rise in strong support of the McCollum Amendment to designate wildfire funding as emergency spending and increase funding for water infrastructure by $470 million. Wildfires, like tornadoes and hurricanes, threaten lives, damage property, and wreak havoc on communities. We shouldn't also allow them to burn through all the funds in this appropriations bill. Many of us have supported an outstanding bill from our colleague, Mr. Simpson, and I'm delighted to be a supporter, to designate some of these costs as emergency spending. I hope that those of us who have already expressed support for that bill can now also support this amendment. This amendment also provides additional funds to address water infrastructure crises in this country. In a 2011 drinking water infrastructure survey, EPA found that nationally $384.2 billion in drinking water upgrades are needed over the next 20 years. And in 2008, EPA reported that approximately $300 billion is needed for wastewater and stormwater infrastructure. Without the amendment, the base bill would slash state revolving funds by over $500 million, cutting 32,000 construction jobs on 207 projects. Failure to replenish the state revolving loan funds will only increase the cost for our state and local governments and slow the improvements of this vital infrastructure. We can't pass this burden on to our constituents, so I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Thank you.
Further discussion? Hearing none, Ms. McCollum is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we speak, there's 2 wildfires burning in Alaska. And so we need a new way forward. So by offering this amendment, if we can light a fire under the Budget Committee to do the right thing and the authorizers to do the right thing, I'm all for it. So we need to also I ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, if you have not joined Mr. Simpson on this bill, to get on it. We speak with volume, with numbers. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back, and I would ask for support of this amendment.
Question is on the McCollum amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. No. Noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to. Are there other amendments? Mr. Visklosky.
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Visklosky.
Objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Chairman, I appreciate that. I appreciate that Buy America language is contained in this bill under the chair and ranking member. It has been now the last 3 years. There has been language added to the bill that I think would effectively undercut the existing language by allowing slab and finished iron and steel products to be imported and then meet the Buy American requirements. My amendment simply would strike that language and would ask for the committee's consideration.
Chairman Calvert.
Thank you, Mr. McCloskey. I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment Today, everyone is able to vote to support American jobs one way or another. A no vote on the amendment supports the base test, which was written to promote fairness and level the playing field for all U.S. manufacturing jobs. I appreciate that Mr. McCloskey is offering his amendment based on his constituents and their jobs, and I included language in the base text in order to support my constituents and the jobs in my district. While we tend to think of the Buy America provision as a pro-U.S. jobs, it's not that simple. The amendment before us will help some U.S. jobs at the expense of others. Many U.S. companies have global processes. Many products originate in the United States, ship beyond the United States border for value-added process, then return to the United States for additional manufacturing, distribution, and sale. Other business models take components or inputs of foreign origin and manufacture those products here in the United States by American workers. The Buy America language as it stands has been narrowly interpreted by EPA. As a result, we end up having a debate about whether U.S. workers are melting and pouring or hot rolling or substantially transforming iron and steel in America, rather than focusing on the best way to create long-term, high-paying jobs that will be rooted in the American economy. The language in the base text seeks to level the playing field for all U.S. manufacturing jobs. We need to adopt policies that foster innovative ways of thinking and economic growth for all, rather than restrictive policies that promote some opportunities for a few. The U.S. manufacturing industry is already feeling the cost of EPA's heavy-handed regulations. They don't need to be further hampered by additional requirements that drive up their costs. It's my hope that members will continue to work with me to find flexibility within this policy so that we're supporting all U.S. jobs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is there further discussion?
Mr. Chair?
Ms. McCollum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in support of this amendment. Steep declines in global iron ore prices has led to more layoffs in Minnesota's Iron Range. Industry experts blame the crash on overproduction of ore from mines in Australia, Brazil, and elsewhere, coupled with a sharp reduction in demand from developing economies, especially in China. So the state of Minnesota felt that it needed to step in to do something to save these iron ore taconite jobs. U.S. Steel will temporarily pay less than taconite mine royalties to the state of Minnesota for the ore it extracts in the Iron Range. It was undertaken by our state's top leaders. The state's executive council, which is made up of the governor and 4 other statewide officials, unanimously granted this 15-month cost release that would add up to $4.5 million retroactive to April. The relief will reduce payments the company must make to the school trust fund and a few other state accounts. So my state is really committed with the decisions it's making, that we make steel and we buy in, we support the Buy America program. So I would just say that if this provision is not removed, it threatens the opportunity to have increased jobs among steel and iron workers in this country, and I could see devastating consequences with the steel workers who produced all the steel that helped America win the greatest war. And with that, I yield back.
Is there Chairman Adderholt.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to rise in support of Ms. Klosky's amendment to strike this new language for the bill. I'm reluctant to oppose it, but and I know, because I know Chairman Calvert has worked hard along with the staff in trying to put this bill together. But the substantial transformation language is something that I think will gut the Buy American criteria that's in this that's in the bill. It'll go from a Made in America to sort of a kind of Made in America. The language would result, at the end of the day, in domestic steel producers and workers being bypassed. It would send 90% of each taxpayer dollar invested in our steel infrastructure to Russia, Brazil, China, and other foreign steel makers. The amendment to strike this new language from the bill is really about jobs. Jobs not only in my home state of Alabama, but also in many congressional districts across the country. The authorizing committee, which is the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, does not support the language. It actually went so far as considering it, but voted in a bipartisan manner to reject it because it was a massive outsourcing loophole to allow foreign iron and steel to be used and our taxpayer-funded infrastructure projects. So the bottom line is taxpayer dollars should be used to ensure that manufacturing jobs remain here in America and don't go to support China, Russia, and other places that are not friendly to the United States. So therefore, I would urge the adoption of this Visclosky amendment, and I yield back my time.
Ms. Ruby. Is there further discussion? Mr. Amadei.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to associate myself with the remarks of my colleague from California, the subcommittee chairman. You know, it's interesting, the history of this language was approved by this committee on a bipartisan basis last year. And while I certainly do not stand in support of anything that goes against the steel industry, whether it be mining in the Northeast or the folks that recycle a bunch of it, this is hitting a fly with a sheet of plywood. Because when we talk about jobs of a lot of folks who manufacture a lot of products in this country with steel that is mined in Minnesota, in Michigan, that is reprocessed by some of the largest companies, which I'm sure you've had discussions with, there are portions of those processes that occur overseas and then they're returned to this country to be manufactured. So for all intents and purposes, it's American steel, no matter how you define it, and it's manufactured by American workers in this country. So while this language may not be the most artful, I would respectfully support the subcommittee chairman in saying this is not the answer. If it's really about protecting American steel, which I support, then we should protect American steel and not penalize those folks who do 90% of their processes in this country with those jobs, with American steel, by basically taking this back to where it was with an EPA interpretation that we sought to address last year that complicated things. Because taking this language out now will put the EPA back in charge of deciding what Buy American is, and with all due respect, I think that's a bad idea. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Is there further discussion? Hearing none, Mr. Visclosky is recognized to close.
Thank you very much. The fact is, the people who have been hurt are the tens of thousands of people who have lost their jobs in the United States of America because our trading partners, I use that term loosely, violate international law. Not just steel, but manufacturing continues to win cases before the ITC. 18 to 24 months later, the plant's closed and the job's gone. The fact is, there is protection for everyone who works in the United States because pursuant to exceptions. If there is an inconsistency with public policy, my language would not stand. It also, if iron and steel products are not produced in the United States, my language does not stand. That's the protection that is provided by amendment. I would ask for the appreciated support of the colleagues. Thank you very much.
Question is on the Visclosky amendment. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, say no. No. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Is there further amendments? Mr. Amadei.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Amadei. On page 60 of the committee report, under the heading Infrastructure Assistance, add at the end the following. The committee emphasizes that any coating processes that are applied to the external service of iron and steel components that otherwise qualify under the procurement preference shall not render such products ineligible for the procurement preference regardless of where the coating processes occur, provided that final assembly of the products occurs in the United States. The committee directs EPA to consider U.S. manufacturing costs, including labor, machining, coating, assembly, and testing when determining if a product is primarily iron or steel.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I apologize for letting it be read, but I think in view of the previous discussion, it's important to point out the three things this does. Recognize the importance of U.S. steel being used in those processes, recognizing the fact that you can leave for a process to occur in your manufacturing process, and recognizing the fact that whatever that does must come back to this country to be finally manufactured. Since we're having American Jobs Love Fest, I think this is an appropriate thing for you to support. It also puts little oversight language in for EPA. I urge your support.
Chairman Calvert.
I rise in support of the gentleman's amendment. As I noted earlier, we need to ensure American manufacturing jobs are not hurt by these provisions. We need to work together to find flexibility with these requirements to ensure that U.S. jobs are not put at a disadvantage. By the way, this is the same report language that we had last year that we accepted by voice, so I would hope that there was no opposition to this.
Mr. Visklowski.
Chairman, I find it interesting provided us with gifts and has an amendment today before us. I rise simply to make the observation, and the chairman is absolutely correct, that this language was included last year. I do not think it is necessary. I think it's redundant because of some of the exceptions I cited. Just want to make my concern known, but I would not object to the gentleman's amendment.
Are you ready for the question? Mr. Amadei, would you like to close?
But thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is report language and not in the base bill. Have a nice day and happy water drinking.
On the Amadei amendment, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. Ayes have it, the amendment's agreed to. Ms. Lowy?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, amendment number 1, waive the reading.
Offered by Mrs. Lowy.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would strike Section 426, which delays implementation of the EPA's lead renovation, repair, and painting rule. According to the CDC, at least 4 million households have children who are exposed to high levels of lead, including 535,000 children younger than 5 years old, with levels in which the CDC recommends public health actions be initiated. The problem is particularly prevalent in low-income communities. There's no safe blood level for children. That's why it is so imperative that we do everything we can to help families avoid lead poisoning. The EPA has proposed reasonable requirements that workers have training and follow lead-safe work practices, and it's important to mention who the rule does not apply to. Do-it-yourselfers, those making improvements to newer homes. The rider that I'm seeking to strike could cost our country dearly. Not only can lead levels permanently hurt children, but it can cost $5,600 in medical treatment, special education expenses for each seriously lead-poisoned child. Many construction companies and contractors have already received training and certification to perform lead-safe work. Delaying this rule over the availability of a commercially available lead testing kit when no renovator needs a test kit to do the job hurts businesses that have already invested in their own funding and families who want their children to be safe. I ask you to vote for the amendment.
Chairman Calvert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose the amendment to strike. When EPA first issued the lead certification rule for contractors back in 2008, the rule offered an exemption from training for those contractors who used the EPA-approved kit to determine that no lead paint existed at the renovation site. To date, EPA has not yet approved a test kit, thereby placing a de facto moratorium on the exemption. So it's clear that EPA never intended to allow contractors to opt out of training via that exception. Nevertheless, the language in the bill prompts EPA to finish what it intended to do: approve a test kit as an alternative to the costly third-party lab testing so as to prevent delays and reduce the cost to home renovations. It's simple, straightforward, common-sense language, whereas EPA's 2008 rule is anything but that. EPA's lead renovation rule set onerous standards for test kits that remain commercially unavailable. And it is yet another example of EPA's finalizing a rule with unattainable standards. As such, I urge a no vote on this amendment to strike.
Is there further discussion? Ms. McCollum?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in support of Ranking Member Lowy's amendment. The language in the bill stops the lead rule until there's a commercially available lead testing kit that meets both false negative and false positive criteria. Are you confused? I was, so I talked to contractors. My home in Minnesota was built in 1903. They were removing some paint. We found hardware underneath the paint. There was so much paint after over 100 years of painting. There was lead. I had some work done here in the Washington, D.C. area recently on a much newer place, and we talked about what's involved in the lead testing. Here's what the contractors told me. Well, we're going to test for lead, and if my place in Minnesota would have tested that there wasn't any lead where we knew there was lead, they'd have to send it out, do something, and have it verified. If it tested for lead, that's the end of it. Done. We knew there was lead, it tested positive for lead, it was over. The contractor, inexpensive kit, easy to do. Here in D.C., we were a little concerned based on, when things had happened and the dates and that. It tested negative. We felt comfortable it was negative. End of story. End of story. Now, if at any time the contractor wasn't sure, they have two options. I found out that there's this little, it's like a gun that you can shoot that reads whether or not positively for a lead kit. Most small business owners who do this don't have it. If they're in doubt, they just send it out. Takes a couple days to get it back. It's cheaper for them than doing the other investment. Or they can, just send it out to begin with. Folks, kids exposed to lead have permanent brain damage. Kids exposed to lead drive up special education costs because we as a society want to make sure that they have the best opportunity to do it. The other thing that contractors told me is parents want to know whether or not there's lead in their homes. Folks, this is not as complicated as people need to make it be, and I suggest you support the Lowy Amendment, support children from lead poisoning, from not getting lead poisoning.
Is there further discussion? Ms. Lowy is recognized to close.
Thank you, and I'll be very brief. I think the facts are clear. I don't think there's anyone in this room that would want to live in a home or send their children to a school that was renovated by a company that needlessly didn't have lead-safe training. So I would ask you to vote for my amendment, and hopefully we will all be together on this important issue. I don't think anyone wants their children or anyone else's children to have lead poisoning. Thank you.
Question is on the Lowy Amendment. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no.
No.
The noes seem to have it. The noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to. Is Mr. Israel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk
Clerk will
designated
read.
as Israel 1.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Israel. Page 59, lines 9 through 23, strike section 120.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My intention is to withdraw this amendment after several of my colleagues have an opportunity to speak to it. And I just want to commend to the attention of the committee this very important issue. This amendment strikes a rider that stops the Fish and Wildlife Service from promulgating a rule and initiatives meant to curb ivory trafficking and the importation, illegal importation of ivory. Mr. Chairman, in 2012, 35,000 elephants in Africa were killed, 96 a day, one every 15 minutes. They will be extinct within a decade. Now, why should that matter to us? Putting aside the humanitarian concerns, there is a national security concern with respect to ivory importation and the slaughter of African elephants. Elephants are being exterminated, and terrorist organizations are profiting from their extermination. Wildlife trafficking generates between $8 billion and $19 billion in revenues every year for the bad guys. And ivory accounts for a very significant portion of those illegal transactions. Ivory poaching is a major source of funding for Al-Shabaab and the Lord's Resistance Army. Now, I think we should be making it harder and not easier for terrorist organizations to be making money and profiting from the poaching of elephants, the destruction of elephants, and the illegal importation of their ivory. There is a rider in this bill that this amendment strikes that would prevent Fish and Wildlife from issuing a rule. Now, I understand some of my colleagues may be opposed to that rule. They may support the rule, but we don't yet have a rule. And so I believe that it's simply common sense to wait for the rule to come out, and then we can address it together collectively and on a bipartisan basis. Let's see what's in the rule before we strike the rule. This bill does give Fish and Wildlife more resources on wildlife traffic, and I want to thank the chairman and commend the chairman for his bipartisan cooperation on that. I respectfully disagree with the decision to give more resources with one hand, at the same time use our hands to stop the administration from promulgating a rule. This, Mr. Chairman, is not just about conservation, it is about our national security. And I do believe that we should be doing everything possible to cut off the flow of funds to terrorist organizations. I hope that we can come to an agreement on this regulation when it is promulgated. I look forward to working with the chairman on a bipartisan basis to address this regulation. I do believe we should wait for the regulation to come out before we stop it. Thank you.
Chairman Calvert.
I appreciate my colleagues' thoughtful comments regarding crisis levels of poaching and wildlife trafficking and need to do something about it. This is a deadly serious matter of national security implications. We both serve on the Defense Appropriations Committee together, and I also serve on the Intelligence Committee and know of the problems that poaching of ivory is causing our national security, especially in northern Africa. That's why this bill has increased funding, as you mentioned, $15 million since fiscal year 2013 in order to fight wildlife poachers and traffickers. Without questions, Republicans do not want to see elephants go extinct. But when the Fish and Wildlife Service made the unilateral decision to ban the trade and transport of products containing ivory that have been in the United States legally for years, we heard from orchestra musicians, art museums, wildlife conservation organizations, collector of fine antiques ranging from chess pieces to pool cues to firearms, and nearly everyone in every organization in between. That's why they're united in support for elephants, but they also are united in opposition to new federal restrictions on products containing ivory. The reality is family heirlooms and rare musical instruments didn't cause the problem, and the Fish and Wildlife should be acknowledging as much. This bill keeps the status quo, allowing for continuing trade and transport so that collectors, musicians, and others can get on with their lives until the Fish and Wildlife Service writes a rule that reflects the legitimate concerns of law-abiding U.S. citizens. The administration is rumored to be just days away from publishing a revised rule to address most of these concerns. If that's the case, if the revised rule solves the problem, then there'll be no need for this provision in the final conference report later this year. In any case, I remain fully committed to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to find a reasonable solution moving forward. Again, I ask my colleague, as you mentioned, to withdraw the amendment. We'll continue to work together to resolve this.
Ms. Louie.
Before you withdraw the amendment, because I think this is so important, and I rise in strong support of the amendment, and I appreciate the chairman's willingness to cooperate. The U.S. is a significant market for ivory. We have a responsibility to take action to prevent the extinction of elephants. One African elephant is poached every 15 minutes. And if this killing rate continues, certain elephants could be extinct within a decade. By ending the trade of ivory within our nation, we can set a powerful precedent for the rest of the world to follow. We must empower the Fish and Wildlife Service to take meaningful steps to hinder the illegal ivory trade while providing reasonable exceptions, such as those which the chairman mentioned for traveling musicians. I do hope we can work together. My distinguished friend from New York mentioned the impact of the trading and the resources it's providing to terrorist groups like Boko Haram and so many others. This is an essential issue. I'm pleased we're addressing it. I look forward to working together with my colleague in the chair to make sure this takes place. Thank you.
Is there further discussion? Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much. I just want to say that the poaching situation has been a priority in the State Foreign Operations Bill. It's from the time that we learned that it was being used for terrorist activities, funding terrorists. And so that's when we put $55 million in our bill from State Foreign Operations toward this. But I want to recognize and make sure that people understand the United States has been a leader in this, been very, very active, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and partner agencies have also been active in poaching and trafficking overseas to oversee what really is happening. I'm concerned about the unintended consequence of a unilateral ban. I think it's really important that we wait until the rule. I'm hearing the same thing. It's just days away, and really see what what happens about that. I'd like to continue to work with the chairman, of course, on this issue.
Mr. Fortenberry.
Subtleties of difference in the room. Everyone is right. Mr. Israel, you're right. This is a source of terrorist funding. It's an affront to our planet. No one wants to see a species in decline. That's why we work with Chairman Granger to include robust funding to prevent wildlife trafficking. The chairman is also right. We would hope that Fish and Wildlife Services expresses some sensitivity to very real concerns about current ownership of antiques, musical instruments, decorative firearms as such. We wouldn't want to criminalize people who have this in their possession. So Ms. McCollum and I have worked extensively on this issue as well. I think everyone's interested, so hopefully we can find a constructive way forward to the appropriate ends that you've very well outlaid. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. McCollum.
Mr. Chairman, as we've heard from everyone, if we're going to stop the slaughter of elephants, we need to stop the trade in illegal ivory, and that's the full trade in illegal ivory. For those who are concerned that the administration's actions are going to be overly restrictive, it's important to recognize that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has strongly signaled that it will make accommodations to allow certain activities to continue that do not pose a threat to elephants, including activities involving musical instruments, antiques, and certain other items containing ivory. They have heard from us loud and clear. I believe that they have listened to us. So as this proposed rule is about to come out, Mr. Chairman, my concern is without a placeholder in a commitment that this rule is going to go through a lot of hearings and people trying to stop it and block it, and in the meantime we don't do anything. So Mr. Chairman, I know that you have your best interest in heart to bringing this trade to an end and come up with and help to work towards a goal of a set of responsible regulations that protect elephants while making accommodations to certain activities. So with that, along with Mr. Israel, Mr. Fortenberry, and Ms. Granger and all that, we all stand ready to help you, Mr. Chairman, in any way we can to continue our leadership in this, because without us leading on this, China won't do anything, Thailand won't do anything. We've had such a great leadership with the work with Ms. Granger and others. We need to also stand up and be leaders on this too. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Israel is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Understanding that this rule is imminent and appreciating the fact that the chairman, the full committee chairman, the ranking member, Ms. Granger, Mr. Fortenberry, and all of us seem to be on the same page on how this should be resolved, if not tactically how we approach it. I will withdraw the amendment. Look forward to working with Mr. Calvert in the future on this issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I withdraw the amendment.
It is withdrawn. Mr. Price.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to engage the chairman in a colloquy regarding the hazardous waste e-manifest program.
Someone's recognized.
And to express my concern that there's no funding for this activity in the fiscal 16 bill. I introduced legislation some time ago to establish this program. I was happy to support the work of Republican colleagues in pushing it through. EPA estimates that a national hazardous waste e-manifest system will reduce the burden associated with preparing shipping manifests by between 300,000 and 700,000 hours at cost savings of more than $75 million a year. I understand the chairman has a number of concerns with the program. The authorization is due to expire at the end of fiscal 15. We have already appropriated more than the original $6 million, and there are questions, important questions about remaining costs, the timeline for full implementation. But that doesn't necessarily indicate a zero funding level for fiscal 2016. Seems that that would risk nipping recent progress in the bud and in preventing the e-manifest system from reaching completion. So I'd like to ask the chairman to comment as to the rationale for this decision and what he anticipates going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Price. Let me say that a program that still relies on a paper-only approach in this day and age is one that's outdated, long overdue for an upgrade. And I believe we should have transitioned to electronic system years ago. FedEx, UPS, Postal Service all transitioned to electronic tracking years ago, so we're long overdue to bringing the program that tracks shipments of hazardous waste into the 21st century. So you and I and the rest of the committee share the same goal of building an electronic tracking system and making it operational. It's more than a question about how we get there. That's why I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this program with you today.
Thank you. I do want to note that some progress has been made. In 2014, EPA completed the regulation that authorizes the electronic transmittal of manifests, began work under a new contract for development of a technical architecture for the system, and began work on the user fee rule. The proposed rule is on track to be completed and published for comment by mid-May of 2016. And earlier this year, the EPA began seeking nominations for candidates for the 9-member Hazardous Waste Electronic Manifest Advisory Board. I'm encouraged by these steps.
Mr. Price, we know you are a tireless advocate for your constituents and a thoughtful and pragmatic appropriator. I know you want to make sure that every taxpayer dollar is invested wisely and that we have a plan in place for sound investments. To date, the committee has appropriated, as you know, $9 million for the development of the e-manifest system, which exceeds the authorized amount of $6 million through FY 2015. EPA has requested an additional $7 million to put the total system costs at $16 million, which far exceeds what Congress originally authorized in 2012. In addition, the e-manifest bill called the system to be built within 3 years by the end of fiscal year 2015. However, we're now looking at a schedule where the system would be built in 2017 or 2018. So we believe the plan that Congress originally approved and the plan that EPA is implementing are now on two different tracks. Without making opinions one way or another, we believe Congress needs to revisit the situation as it currently exists in the context of reauthorization. Congress can take a closer look at the proposed costs, timeline, implementation, and if justified, sign off on a plan for fiscal year 2016 and beyond. And once we've signed off that approach, we'll appropriate those amounts accordingly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your explaining the committee's approach, what you've gone through, the rationale for what's in the fiscal 16 bill. I understand the concerns, but I do want to emphasize we do want to get to the same goal, a functioning e-manifest system that will meet the needs of the user community. So I ask the chairman if he'll be able to work with us, work with me as we move forward to ensure that a cost-effective system is built as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. I'd like to work with you, the authorizing committee, and anyone else to make sure we're on the right path and we have a system that works for everybody. I'd like to see e-manifest system reauthorized beyond fiscal year 2015 with a clear plan in place, and that plan will be stronger when it's formed in a bipartisan manner, so I look forward to working with you on this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there further amendments? Ms. Pingree.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I mentioned earlier, I feel fortunate to have been a member of this committee and have been very grateful for the chair and ranking member for working so closely with us in crafting parts of this bill, assisting my constituents in my state with issues that we care deeply about. We've had a lot of interesting and informative hearings, good bipartisan dialogue on the range of issues that come before this committee, arts and humanities, tribal issue.
Does the gentlelady have an amendment?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, of course. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Ms. Pingree.
I ask that the amendment be considered read.
Is dispensed with. Gentlelady is now recognized.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I was just so happy to get into my speech there. But I won't repeat the parts I've already said. But I was at this important moment where I said, we have lots of great dialogues. They're often very bipartisan. Sometimes one of the more controversial ones we touch on is the Endangered Species Act, which of course is the topic of my amendment today. This amendment would strike 3 of the Endangered Species Act related provisions that are in the underlying bill. the provisions on sage grouse, gray wolves, and the northern long-eared bat. Now, the reason I'm offering this amendment is not because I think there are never any problems with the listing of these species as endangered. I do understand the concerns of my friends in this room today who are worried that a listing, what it could mean and what effect it could have in their communities. For us in Maine, some of our foresters have expressed concern with the listing of the northern long-eared bat as endangered, which is why I'm working with them to make sure that the process at the Fish and Wildlife Service includes their voices. But as far as I'm concerned, that's exactly the point. There is a process at Fish and Wildlife for these listings. It needs to be followed so that fair consideration of these listings can be done. The ESA is too important of a law for us to address in the way we're doing today. It is one of those laws that was created in a bipartisan manner. It has bipartisan support, and it works. For me, there can't be any better proof than the bald eagle. When I first moved to Maine as a teenager, which is 40-plus years ago, it was very, very rare to see a bald eagle. The bald eagle had just recently been listed as endangered. It was one of the first species to be listed in 1967. At that time, there were only 30 nesting pairs in Maine, almost all of them in one small, remote part of the state. But the Endangered Species Act worked. The bald eagle made a comeback, and in 2007, it was removed from the list. Now there are over 630 nesting pairs of bald eagles in Maine. Going from 30 to 630 is quite an accomplishment. I and my constituents see bald eagles all the time. What the ESA can do and why it was created 40 years ago was not only to list a species as threatened or endangered, but to help us conserve and restore American treasures. So I would like to see us strip the riders from the bill, work with Fish and Wildlife Service to make sure that our constituents' voices are truly heard, and that species who need protection are truly protected. I urge support of my amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Chairman Calvert.
I rise in opposition to the gentlelady's amendment. As I said in my opening, we have no interest in interfering with science, no interest in letting any species go extinct. But we are concerned about federal regulatory actions lacking in basic fairness and common sense, and the continued use of the judicial system to make land management decisions. On the northern long-eared bat, in April, the Fish and Wildlife Service published a rule that if you adopt certain habitat conservation practices, you're not liable for incidental take of northern long-eared bats. But the rule went a step too far by prejudging who is capable of adopting those habitat practices and who isn't. Over the past 4 months, we've heard from numerous people willing to adopt these habitat practices who've been unfairly prejudged. The provision in this bill simply directs Fish and Wildlife Service back to the drawing board and levels the playing field. In addition, the bill provides $10 million to address white nose syndrome that is devastating the northern long-eared bat and other bat species. On the gray wolf, earlier this year, the Director of Fish and Wildlife Service was asked in the subcommittee's hearing, based upon the best scientific information available to the Fish and Wildlife Service, have wolves in Wyoming and the Great Lakes met their recovery goals? Do these states have responsible management plans, and should these wolves be delisted? His answer was yes on all 3 points. In 2011, 2012, the Fish and Wildlife Service did exactly that and published final rules delisting wolves in western Great Lakes and Wyoming, respectively. A federal court subsequently threw out both rules on technical grounds unrelated to the conservation of the species. The bill reinstates the Fish and Wildlife Service decision and brings balance back to the Endangered Species Act that is frequently wrapped around the axle of the judicial system. On the greater sage grouse, our position has not changed since the provision was enacted last year. Contrary to predictions in the press last year's rider did not slow down the unprecedented state, local, and federal collaboration to conserve the species. Last year's rider did not hasten the decline of populations. And so long as these facts continue to hold, then the arbitrary September 30th, 2015 settlement deadline can afford to slip. We need to get this one right, because once the species goes on the list, it rarely comes off. In the meantime, we're doing everything we can to help the Secretary get a not warranted finding by providing the full $64 million she requested for conservation of the species. The conclusion of this, the Endangered Species Act hinges upon the guarantee that once a species is recovered, the federal government will return management back to the states. If that guarantee doesn't hold up, states will push to reassert their authority to manage fish and wildlife within their own borders, an authority predating the Constitution. This push by the states is a reality we see playing out with bats, wolves, greater sage grouse, delta smelt. The list goes on and on and on. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment.
Is there further discussion? Ms. McCollum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in support of the Pingree Amendment. This amendment would strike very damaging anti-endangered species riders from the bill. And I want to just talk about wolves for a while. I know a little more about wolves than I ever thought I would, because I was in the state legislature when the whole issue of the gray wolf came up. And we worked very, very hard working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, RDNR, and everything. We came up with a state plan. We've been moving forward. Now, I appreciate what the chairman said about all states having plans, but I don't think all plans are equal. And I think a lot of the problem that we are encountering is because the state of Wyoming has not come forward with a great state plan. And so there was, a court case that was filed and things that were, put out because of a technicality. Well, those attorneys did everybody a disservice then by not doing things, crossing the T's and dotting the I's. So these policy writers, I believe, run contrary to the fundamental principle that science should govern the determination under our nation's environmental laws. And when it's time for the states to take control as the delisting moves forward, states need to stand up and act responsibility to do this, because as one of my colleagues pointed out to me, and as you all know is true, a gray wolf doesn't know the boundary between Canada and northern Minnesota, doesn't know the boundary between North Dakota and Minnesota, and so these wolves travel around. And that's why it's important that the states work cooperatively, that one state can't punish a group of other states that have worked cooperatively to make sure that the gray wolf is delisted. So these writers really need to go because we need to bring all states up to using science. We need to be talking to the constituents, as Ms. Pingree said, to make sure that their voices are heard so that we can come together in a responsible action. So for these reasons, I support the amendment, and I urge my colleagues to join me in removing these harmful writers from this bill.
Chairman Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank the gentlelady from Minnesota for her observations. But it's only science if you agree with the conclusions. That's what everybody in here believes. If you agree with what comes out of it, then, boy, that's science. And anybody that disagrees with that isn't science. That's the reality of what we face today. There's an old saying that there's nothing certain in life except death and taxes. There's now three things: death, taxes, and that if you're Fish and Wildlife Service and you make a decision, you will be sued. That's the reality. No matter what decision they make, they are going to be sued by one side or the other. And that's what's happened with wolves. Contrary to what the gentlelady from Minnesota said, Wyoming came up with a management plan. Originally, when I want to say delisted wolves in Idaho, but we didn't delist wolves in Idaho. Fish and Wildlife Service delisted wolves. They went to court in Idaho and Montana. Someone sued Fish and Wildlife. They went to the court. Judge, overturned the delisting. And we added language similar to this that said in Idaho and Wyoming, Fish and Wildlife's rules, we told them to reissue that rule that was delisting them, and that it was not subject to judicial review. That's the same thing we did here with the Great Lakes wolves and with Wyoming. We didn't include Wyoming because Wyoming did not have a state management plan, and we insisted that they get one. And they did, and it has been approved by Fish and Wildlife Service. And when I ask Mr. Ash, the Director of Fish and Wildlife Service, as the Chairman has said, have wolves in Wyoming and the Greater Lakes met their recovery goals? Do the states have a responsible management plan? And should these wolves be delisted? He said yes on all 3 points. But guess what? Somebody doesn't like that. Some group decides they want to sue them. So that's what they do, and now it's in court. All we're doing is saying the Fish and Wildlife's decision based on science should stand. And no, it is not subject to true judicial review. Unfortunately, the Endangered Species Act, which we all support, the idea behind the Endangered Species Act, originally when it was enacted, it was almost universally supported. And it was to protect that beautiful bald eagle, and then other species. Unfortunately, when you look at the recovery rate of some of these species, the fact is it hasn't done the job we anticipated. Has it helped? Certainly. But too many organizations use the Endangered Species Act today to control land and water, not to recover species. And we need to reform the Endangered Species Act. It has not been reauthorized for 7 years now, or 26 years. It has not been reauthorized. Congress needs to have a discussion on this. But these provisions in these bills that this amendment would strike are based on good science. They're not just this committee saying we're trying to protect somebody or some area of the country or some state or somebody's district. I thank the chairman and would urge the members to vote against this amendment.
Ms. Lee.
Chairman, first, I'd like to associate myself with the remarks of Congresswoman Pingree, and thank you for this amendment. This amendment would strike the very terrible Endangered Species Act policy riders that are included in this bill. Mr. Chair, as you know, the Endangered Species Act is the strongest and it's the most critical federal law protecting our precious imperiled plants, wildlife, and their habitat. Since 1973, more than 2,000 plants and animals have been protected and brought back from the endangered species status, like the California condor. But these dangerous policy riders in this bill would undermine years of national efforts to protect wildlife, including the endangered gray wolf and greater sage grouse population. Now, I know that this is not what we want to see. It's exactly, though, what these policy riders would do. So I hope we support this very important amendment and defend all of these creatures from endangerment and threats to extinction. I thank you and yield back. And thank you again for this amendment.
Ms. Lowy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong support of this amendment, which would protect the Endangered Species Act by striking the 3 riders from the bill. The Endangered Species Act is one of the most effective and important conservation laws ever passed by Congress. Its success is due in large part to careful scrutiny of scientific evidence and the critical analysis of all factors related to the status of a species. These riders meddle in the process, dismantle crucial sections of the Endangered Species Act, forever weakening the protections they offer. For instance, the section pertaining to wolves prohibits judicial review, even though 2 separate federal judges ruled that state management plans were not sufficient to protect wolves. Last time I checked, our judicial system was critical to our democratic system of government. In my judgment, we will cause incredible damage to the integrity of the Endangered Species Act if we prioritize politics over the environment. And I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. I yield.
Mr. Amelday.
And I want to associate myself with the remarks of my colleague from Maine on the subcommittee. When she talks about following the procedures and stuff like that, I couldn't be more with you. I've worked almost the whole time I'm here to get my arms around the issues regarding the resource and the habitat of the greater sage hen, I call it. If Mr. Morgan was still here, he'd ask the question on how they procreate if they're all hens, but we won't go there today. But let me tell you what my experience has been when we talk about careful scrutiny and critical analysis. In my state, in the last 20 years, we've lost habitat, 7 million acres, to wildland fire, subject we talked about a little earlier before. And so, when you work through that process and say, if you really want to conserve the habitat for this species in my state, we need to concentrate on fire. And you know what we got? 3 million acres, that's a fraction of a small New England state, 3 million acres of exclusion areas. and you sit there and say, if the primary problem is catastrophic wildland fire, tell me the lightning storm that checks where lines are on a map before it sends a bolt of lightning down. And so it's those frustrating things like that where you're sitting there going, with all due respect, Mr. Ash and your agency, when another colleague says this is about controlling land and water and not really about restoring, I got to tell you, quite frankly, those mean people who are the chairman of the subcommittee and the former chair, I would have liked to have seen more. And they, if it makes you feeling better, said no. So I will just tell you that there's another side of that story that says if we're really about the resource and we're really about that, then let's go in and pull for that. And when you get decisions that are not transparent, that get put into these things that say, okay, we're going to do de facto wilderness areas, it's like that doesn't help with lightning, which is the primary threat in my state. The other thing I'll tell you is we all tend to focus on ESA, but since most of the land out west is federally owned, that quite frankly, very clever thing in the Department of Interior, they're putting a whole bunch of the ESA stuff in their resource management plans. So quite frankly, in my state, doesn't matter if we do anything under the ESA, because it's all in, it's kind of like the planning and zoning document for those districts throughout the state, which they control 87% of my state. So they're going to get it through the resource management plan in a context here too. So I will just say, I would love to hug the issue and work on the stuff that's really resource related, but when you get de facto wilderness areas to fight lightning, it absolutely escapes me as to the effectiveness of that, and that's what we very much have on that species in the Great Basin. I yield back.
Mr. Dent?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too have very serious concerns about this amendment. The amendment strikes the section on the northern long-eared bat. In my state of Pennsylvania, virtually the whole state is considered a habitat for the northern long-eared bat, and we are losing northern long-eared bats, not so much because of human activity, because of some fungus. We all realize it needs to be addressed, and I think the provision that was placed in the bill was a good one, because we're very concerned that if we take this to the extreme, we're going to shut down a lot of gas development in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and other states. So it's a very serious issue. The language in the bill on the northern long-eared bat is appropriate, and we should not strike it. I oppose the amendment. Thank you.
There being no further discussion, Ms. Pingree is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll make it simple here. There's no question when you bring up the Endangered Species Act, there will be a lively conversation, and I think that it is time for us to examine the issues around this and understand many of the complexities that people face. My amendment here only says we should strike the 3 provisions in the bill because what we have now is the best opportunity on things like the northern long-eared bat, which is a consideration and a concern in my state. It's the best way to go through a public process, have people be able to give input, and make sure we're doing the right thing. So I yield back the balance of my time, and I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment.
The question is on the Pingree amendment. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, say no. No. The noes seem to have it. The noes have it.
Could we have a
Recorded vote is requested. A sufficient number supporting. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt? Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei? Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop? No. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert? No. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter? Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw? Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar? No. Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson? No. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro? Aye. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent? No. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart? No. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr? Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fattah? Mr. Fattah, aye. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen? Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger? Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Hera Butler? Ms. Hera Butler, no. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Israel? Aye. Mr. Israel, aye. Mr. Jenkins? No. Mr. Jenkins, no. Mr. Jolly? Mr. Jolly, no. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter? Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer? Aye. Mr. Kilmer, aye. Ms. Lee? Aye. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy? Aye. Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum?
Aye.
Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Palazzo? Mr. Palazzo, no. Ms. Pingree? Aye. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, aye. Mr. Ridgel? Mr. Ridgel, no. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Roba-Allard? Ms. Roba-Allard, aye. Mr. Rupertsberger? Mr. Rupertsberger, aye. Mr. Ryan?
Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Viscoski. Mr. Viscoski, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded? Judge Carter?
Mr. Carter, no.
Are there others? Members wish to change their vote? Clerk will tally.
Mr. Chairman, while they're compiling,
Gentleman's recognized.
I just want the committee to recognize that I am wearing my Tampa Bay Lightning blue in mourning for my friend, Mr. Jolly. It's remarkable what we can do with very little sleep. My Blackhawks kept me up late last night in Chicago, early morning flight. But I do believe we're probably all a little hungry by now, and I think there was this little gentleman's wager. If Mr. Jolly can respond, because I'm sure we're all hungry by now. I believe there was some Tampa sandwiches involved.
The gentleman will yield.
Certainly.
I would like to point out to the committee that Chicago had a 66-year head start in hockey.
True.
But secondly, we did wager, and I wagered a black and grouper sandwich.
Sandwich. Oh, it's
I wanted to
singular.
wager snapper, but as a result of federal regulators, I'm not sure a member of Congress is allowed to catch a snapper in the Gulf of Mexico right now. But because of the good work of CJS, Mr. Culberson, we have plenty of grouper we can catch, so I will honor that wager. And congratulations to my colleague in Chicago.
And thank you. I appreciate that. It was an original 6 hockey team against an original 30 hockey team. And I do recognize it's, if Chicago had won, it would be cheesecake for everybody, but whatever the gentleman from Tampa can afford. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
On this vote, the yeas are 19, the nays are 32. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Bishop?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to say a few words about something that's troubling.
Strike the last word.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. I just want to say something that's troubling to me about report language that's in the bill concerning the Eisenhower Memorial Commission. I've been honored to serve on the commission to build a permanent memorial for President Eisenhower in front of the U.S. Department of Education. The report language references a lack of consensus on the memorial design. That is not true. As a member of the commission, I've been there when it's been voted on repeatedly. There has been some controversy, and of course, there have been modifications to the design many times in efforts to get the approval of the Eisenhower family, which has been on and off. In addition, the design is near approval by the 2 federal agencies that are charged with responsibility of approving federal projects. That's the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts and the National Capital Planning Commission. It just doesn't seem to make sense to throw away the $40 million in taxpayer dollars that have already been used to come to this consensus over the design and to start all over, which would require at least another $20 million in the process. If we have to start over, there won't be any World War II veterans left to witness the opening of the memorial to President Eisenhower. The commission has a new chairman, Senator Pat Roberts, who served with a number of us in the House before he went to the lower body. Representative Mike Thompson also serves on the commission. I'd like to urge that the committee reconsider this attack on the Eisenhower Memorial Commission and let it continue to do its work.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will.
I had an interesting conversation with Senator Roberts yesterday, who's also my friend, my first chairman, when he was chairman of the Ag Committee years ago. As you know, at this point, the family, the Eisenhower family, is opposed to this design. I talked to Susan, David, Mary, Ann, everybody. Hopefully between now and the time we go to conference, I'm sure the Senate will have different language. We can have a conversation about this as we move forward. But we do respect the family and their concerns, and those concerns probably should be considered and as we move this process along.
Yes, sir, and I appreciate the gentleman's comments, and I assure the gentleman that the family's comments have been weighed and considered repeatedly over the last several years. I yield back. Thank you.
Are there further amendments? Mr. Jenkins.
Thank you. I have an amendment at the table.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Jenkins. At the end of the bill.
Ask that it be considered
Without
read.
objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, to the chairman of the subcommittee, the ranking member. Thank you all for your extraordinary work on this bill. Ladies and gentlemen, what my amendment does is simply prohibits the administration from moving forward with issuing new, costly ozone regulations, since many counties have not even been able to or have not met the existing ozone standards that are in place. This is just common sense, because what's happening is that the EPA, with the new proposed standards, which are estimated to be finalized later this year, this is simply moving the goalposts from where we are today to a point in the future, again, where a number of counties have not already even met the existing standards. I'm hoping that this amendment actually gets some bipartisan support, because there's a number of folks from the other side of the aisle who, when these proposed new ozone standards were issued, actually raised concern about them themselves. So I'm hoping that we have bipartisan support for this amendment. And what this amendment simply does is say that you can't move forward on the new ones until at least 85% of the counties have met the current standards. So let's get everybody up to speed on the current standards before we lay on a new set of standards, so-called moving the goalposts. Why is this so important? It's so important because the costs involved with the estimated new standards are devastating. Even the EPA itself has estimated that it will cost $15 billion per year for implementation of the new standards. There are other entities, organizations, that estimate that this number could be as much as $140 billion per year for the implementation. Now, there's a map, and if you look at the map and you see the marked colors, and I can only see 4 states that do not have an indication in it. And what this shows is that virtually the entire country, almost all of the states, have areas that will not meet the new higher standards as the EPA imposed. This is the $15 to $140 billion cost for implementation. We hear a chorus of support for a new highway funding bill. We all are supporting more money of reauthorization for highway. In the Clean Air Act, the EPA is authorized to direct or to recommend to the Federal Highway Authority that they not give highway funding to those states that don't meet the clean air standards. We need this amendment to make sure that we don't have the overburden regulations, the limitations on permitting, and enables us to move forward. So I encourage, in a bipartisan way, a support for this amendment to make sure that we don't allow the EPA to move the goalposts so we can get people up to the standards before we take a step forward. I yield back.
Chairman Calvert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Jenkins. I'd like to associate myself with the points just raised. Further, I'd like to point out that EPA just finalized the regulation to implement the 2008 standard in April. We're providing resources in this bill to help those counties that are in non-attainment. Meanwhile, the agency proposed more stringent standards for ozone last December before finalizing the implementation for the 2008 standard. This shows how broken the process is. This also puts EPA on a schedule to issue a final standards in fiscal year 2016 that will put counties and air districts, like mine, into further non-attainment. I'd like to point out that the first area in the country to do air control was the South Coast Air Quality District in Southern California. Matter of fact, that was written into law by then Assemblyman Jerry Lewis, the former chairman of this committee. I've been very much supportive of air standards, certainly in our area, which is one of the most populous areas in the United States. But we can't meet those standards yet for 2008, though we have made tremendous strides in cleaning up air in the South Coast Air Quality District. My district and many districts continue to dig its way out of non-attainment, and EPA continues to change the goalposts where we just get into a deeper hole. The agency has hundreds of backlog state implementation plans for which they have not yet even reviewed. But EPA continues to put those statutory responsibilities aside in favor of writing new rules and more stringent standards. Imagine if we do, as Mr. Jenkins mentioned, pass a transportation bill, and we in Southern California cannot get highway money to develop roads and highways, which we desperately need, like everyone else here. And even though we have done more to clean up air than any other part of the country relative to what we've done in the past, we would be denied those funds. So EPA needs to use resources we provided in this bill to play catch-up on the statutory obligations and help communities implement the 2008 standard. And when 85% of the communities have achieved the latest standards, an EPA should consider whether or not revisions are necessary. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I certainly support Mr. Jenkins' amendment.
Chair wishes to associate himself with the remarks of both the chairman and Mr. Jenkins. Ms. McCollum?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would oppose this amendment. The amendment would block the EPA from making a critical update to its own ozone standard until 25% of the states are in non-attainment. Consequently, that would put millions of Americans' health at risk. Ozone is the main component in smog, and it has been scientifically proven to aggravate lung disease, increase the frequency and severity of asthma attacks, and reduce lung function. Heard of a Air Alert Day, Ozone Action Day, where children are told that they can't go outside and play. People who have compromised health are told to remain indoors. And anybody with asthma, well, they're really worried about what going outside and doing moderate activity could mean for them that day. The Clean Air Act requires the EPA to review its ozone standards every 5 years. So this isn't they wake up one morning and say, oh, we're going to move the goalpost. They are doing what they are required to do by law every 5 years. This update is based on strong scientific evidence, including 1,000 scientific studies that show the harmful effect of ozone on human health. The EPA estimates the benefited update standard of 70 parts per billion will yield in health benefits savings to our health care costs of $13 billion each year. So that's a savings to our health account, but imagine what that means to that individual, not even having to go to the emergency room, not having to save the money because they've been able to have good health to begin with. The EPA is barred by the Supreme Court from considering costs when settling public health standards under the Clean Air Act. In other words, the Supreme Court has said public health has a high standing. I would like to also notice that since the last update in 2008, costs have fallen drastically due to new technologies. But in the entire history, since 1971 of the ozone standard, Congress has never stopped in and blocked it with a policy writer. Posing arbitrary limits and prohibits the EPA what it can and cannot do on ozone updates is reckless and is out of touch with what American people want. They want clean air. So waiting until 25% of the states reach non-attainment just kicks this can down the road. We have a responsibility to protect millions of Americans affected by ozone pollution, and for that reason, I oppose the gentleman's amendment. And I can't speak with 100% certainty, but I think with 99.9% certainty that no transportation funding has ever been withheld because of non-attainment.
Would the gentleman yield just for a second?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
EPA, as you're right, every 5 years, they're to review the prior standard. They're not required to revise it. And the EPA, this is because they were pretty significant ozone standards set in 2008, a significant part of this country are finding themselves in a very difficult position to meet those standards. There's background ozone, naturally occurring ozone, and then, of course, ozone in this case caused by human activity. And certain areas are going to have a very difficult time meeting those standards. So I would hope that we could accept Mr. Jenkins' amendment and try to get the technology together yet, because I don't think the technology is there, and this would certainly cost the economy significantly. Thank you for yielding.
Well, and so, Mr. Chairman, to reclaim just a second of my time, 1,000 scientific studies show the harmful effect of ozone on human health, and we need to put human health and the EPA's responsibility to guard it at our forefront.
Is there further discussion? If not, Mr. Jenkins is recognized to close.
Thank you. Just one quick word. Again, it's not 25%, it's only 15%. We're at 85% is the amendment, so it's only for 15% rather than the 25 that you referenced a couple of times. Let me just conclude by saying this map, over 600, well, almost 600 counties would be in the non-attainment. This is the $15 billion to $140 billion annual cost. For my state, the costs are estimated to be $2 billion per year, nearly 10,000 lost jobs as a result. And these numbers, I suggest, would be similar throughout this country in your all's districts. This would have devastating impacts, again, on highways, manufacturing, agriculture. I encourage a yes vote on the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Question is on the Jenkins amendment. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed will say no. No. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Recorded vote is requested. Sufficient number in support. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert. Aye. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter. Aye. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Crenshaw, aye. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, aye. Ms. DeLauro. No. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Dent. Mr. Dent, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Farr. Mr. Farr, no. Mr. Fatah. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry. Fortenberry, aye. Mr. Feelinghuisen. Mr. Feelinghuisen, aye. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, aye. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler, aye. Mr. Honda. Mr. Honda, no. Mr. Israel. Mr. Israel, no. Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Jolly. Mr. Jolly, aye. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer. I'm sorry, Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, no. Mr. Kilmer, no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, no. Mrs. Lowy.
No.
Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCullum.
No.
Ms. McCullum, no. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo, aye. Ms. Pingree.
No.
Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Price. No. Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley. No. Mr. Quigley, no. Mr. Ridgel. Aye. Mr. Ridgel, aye. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, aye. Mr. Rogers. Aye. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, aye. Ms. Roba Allard. Ms. Roba Allard, no. Mr. Rupersberger. Mr. Rupersberger, no. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan, no. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, no. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, aye. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Visklosky. Mr. Visklosky, no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye.
Are there members who wish to be recorded? Mr. Fatah is no.
Mr. Fatah,
Other
no.
members wish to be recorded. Ms. Capter.
The gentle lady, where are you? The gentle lady is recorded as an aye.
Yes, I'd like to know, please.
Ms. Capter, no.
Are there other members who wish to change their vote? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 31, the nays are 20. The amendment is agreed to. Mr. Quigley,
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
clerk will read.
Ask that it be waived.
Without objection, the reading is waived.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I rise today in strong opposition to the anti-clean water rider in this bill. This harmful rider would block the EPA and Army Corps from moving forward with a recently finalized rule clarifying protections for small streams and wetlands under the Clean Water Act. For more than 4 decades, the Clean Water Act has protected our right to enjoy safe water to drink and pristine places to swim. Since it was updated in 1972, the Clean Water Act has protected nearly 2 million miles of streams and millions of acres of wetlands across our country. The law didn't just protect the health of the Mississippi or our Great Lakes, it also recognized the importance of the smaller streams and wetlands that create a vast, interconnected system. My amendment strikes the controversial anti-clean water rider in the bill, will help to fulfill the Clean Water Act's original promise to make America's waters fishable and swimmable for all. For more than a decade, 20 million wetland acres and 2 million stream miles have been at increased risk of pollution and destruction following 2 convoluted Supreme Court rulings and subsequent agency guidance. These decisions created a confusing, time-consuming, and frustrating process for determining what waters are protected under federal law. The Waters of the U.S. rule clarifies about which waters are protected under the Clean Water Act and, in fact, narrows the historic scope of protected waters. Furthermore, the rule gives much-needed certainty to farmers, landowners, and businesses, saving them time and money. America's 47 million sportsmen rely on clean water for access to quality days in the field, hunting, angling, and enjoying other outdoor-based recreation. The rule is a simple, important step toward restoring Clean Water Act protections for thousands of the streams that feed into our drinking water, serving 30.6 million in the Great Lakes Basin and 117 million across the country. Let's be clear. The administration's Clean Water Rule does not add to, expand, or broaden the reach of EPA regulations. It simply clarifies protections for small streams and wetlands that contribute to drinking water supplies, filter our pollutants, and help to protect us from flooding. In many ways, this bill shows just how much disagreement exists in this committee and this Congress about the best ways to protect our environment. But I hope that if there is one thing we can agree on, it's providing clean and safe drinking water for our children and generations to come. Let's put aside the politics, support the Clean Water Act and my amendment. Thank you, and I yield back.
Chairman Calvert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't come to surprise that I rise in opposition to this amendment. Everything about EPA's Water of the U.S. rule has been flawed since day one. It's clear EPA had an agenda to implement a rule that they weren't going to be told, and they weren't going to be told otherwise. On day one, EPA claimed they were not expanding the waters under the jurisdiction, but now we know that more permits will be required, and the final rule is worse than proposed. Further, EPA claimed that the rule was based upon sound science, but they released the science only after the outcry about the rule. Then EPA changed the name to call this the Clean Water Rule and took to social media to lobby the public, which has led to questions whether EPA violated the Anti-Lobbying Act and the Department of Justice opinions. And the Corps of Engineers found that more than half of the comments on the rule were opposed, 58% to be exact, but only a few weeks later EPA claimed that 87% were in favor. It's been process foul after process foul. The numbers just don't add up. The message is a false narrative, and the agency again finds itself on shaky legal ground, both on process and substance. In 2006, the Supreme Court determined that EPA and the Corps of Engineers did have the authority to regulate non-navigable waters under the Clean Water Act. But I'm certain EPA's final rule violates that. Therefore, the language in FY16 bill protects the authority of the states by preventing the EPA from implementing its regulation and expanding its jurisdiction. I certainly urge a no vote on this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes himself. And I must speak in opposition to this amendment. As I've said before, The proposed waters of the United States rule is one of the largest land grabs in history by a federal agency. Even with over 1 million comments from farmers, energy producers, coal miners, manufacturers, others, all expressing serious concerns, EPA continues to press on with this job-killing legislation and regulation. Specifically, farmers expressed concern that they would need additional permits for common farming practices like spraying fertilizer. During the comment period of this rule, EPA told us that they were going to give farmers' concerns due consideration. We now know that never happened. The American Farm Bureau says that the latest version of the rule is even more harmful to farmers than the initial proposal. EPA is not listening. Their mind is made up. And Congress must now push back on this wrong-headed attempt to legislate through regulation. Not doing so will mean lost jobs, more uncertainty for those who live and work near lakes and streams and tributaries, ditches, ponds, lakes, and so on. So I urge a no vote on this amendment. Ms. McCollum.
I rise in supporting the Quigley Amendment to strike the section prohibiting the new rule on the federal jurisdiction of waters of the U.S. Folks, just a couple of weeks ago, the Obama administration issued its formal rule that clarifies the limits of the federal authority under the Clean Water Act, reducing red tape, providing more certainty to communities that their streams, wetlands, rivers, and lakes will be protected. Instead of the confusion and case-by-case determinations about which waters are covered, the rule says a physical, measurable boundary for the first time about where Clean Water Act coverage begins and ends. The rule does not expand the waters covered. In fact, it will actually reduce the scope and provide a new focus on those critically important waters protected by clean water. Additionally, this rule, and I want to state this clearly, this rule does not create any new permitting. If you needed a permit before, you need to get one now. And it maintains all previous exemptions and exclusions. If you were excluded before, you're excluded now. The rule ensures that waters protected under the Clean Water Act are more precisely defined, more predictably determined, making permitting costs less expensive, easier, and faster for business and industry. Prohibiting the EPA from implementing the rule will only put back all the confusion and jurisdiction over water and the health of many communities at risk because their waterways will be at risk. This is a harmful rider, and it should be struck, and I thank the gentleman for offering the amendment.
Chairman Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I get so tired of arguing this argument on the waters of the United States. We've been doing it for several years. The courts, Supreme Court, essentially said in two different decisions that the term navigable waters is kind of loose out there. What does that mean? How do you determine what's navigable? Navigable to what? A steamship? A canoe? A rubber boat? I don't know. So rightfully they said, this is confusing. You guys need to clear that up. Well, the EPA decided that the way to clean it up is just say, we'll take control of all the waters of the United States. That'll clean it up. That'll bring certainty. And admittedly, the Farm Bureau and everybody else wants certainty in this decision. But you know, as I've said in the past, a hanging brings certainty. I'm just not sure it's the results you want. And that's pretty much what they've done here. And I'm so tired of everybody saying that what this new rule does is say that all of these waters that were unregulated before, that contributed to dirty water going into the streams that were regulated, that all of these unregulated waters out there will now be regulated under the Clean Water Act. That's false. They were not unregulated. It's just that they were regulated by the states. And while I know some of you have a hard time believing it, the states can do a good job. And they do a good job. And in fact, if you follow the logic of the connectivity rule that they're talking about, because, you know, it's one stream's connected to another stream's connected to another stream. Pretty soon it all goes in the Mississippi if you're in central United States. There is no way you cannot eventually take this rule to say that it also includes groundwater. Because guess what? Surface water and groundwater are connected. And I tell you, as I've told the director of the EPA, you want to start a water war in the West, this rule will do it. And if you start trying to control groundwater, I'll guarantee you that it will do it. They need to go back to the drawing board to address the real concerns that the Supreme Court had with how you define waters of the United States that fall under the Clean Water Act and those that are left to the regulation of the states. I mean, they're regulating streams that run maybe 2 or 3 months a year sometimes, if that, if you have a good snowpack. They've gone way overboard beyond what Congress ever intended with the Clean Water Act. This stops that. I would urge my members to support this, or to oppose this amendment.
Are there further speakers? If not, Mr. Quigley's got to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can't tell you how disappointed I am. Here, I wrangle a free lunch for all of you out of Mr. Jolly, and I expect at least some favorable consideration in return, but I guess I expected too much. Look, respectfully, here's how I'd put this. The fact that all water is connected should be the reason that you support the EPA to keep it all clean. You know, they have to do this on an integrated basis because this all flows into the bigger waters, and it's all water that we drink and swim in. It's something we need to protect for the future as well. Second, this actually does narrow the scope and give some certainty here, and it was long overdue. And indeed, the Supreme Court did mess this up with some extraordinarily confusing decisions. So this wasn't easy to do, but they did it. So I respectfully ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this amendment to get rid of this rider. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Question is on the Quigley amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. No. Those seem to have it. The noes have it. Requested vote, and a member of the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop.
No.
Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert.
No.
Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter.
No.
Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole.
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar.
No.
Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr. Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah. Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Feelingheisen. Feelingheisen, no. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler, no. Mr. Honda. Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Israel. Aye. Mr. Israel, aye. Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, no. Mr. Jolly. Mr. Jolly, no. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy.
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo, no. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mr. Ridgel. Mr. Ridgel, no. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo-Allard. Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Rupersberger. Mr. Rupersberger, aye. Mr. Ryan. Aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson. Amen. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Voskowski. Mr. Voskowski, aye. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, aye. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded or change their vote? Clerk will tally. Chair will note that the floor votes are to come around 1:15, so we have a half hour to finish the bill, which I think we can. On this vote, the yeas are 19, the nays are 32. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Cole.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by
Reading
Mr.
be
Cole.
dispensed
Without
with.
objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I've looked over this bill, I've noticed that it simply doesn't have enough riders on it, so I thought perhaps we ought to offer at least one more that I think has merit to be considered. In March of 2015, the federal government issued new regulations on fracking on BLM and Indian land. Now, frankly, historically, this has been an area that in most parts of the country have been left to the states. States have done a pretty good job. In this case, though, the explanation for the need of the new regulations was to protect drinking water. And yet we have a new EPA study that says fracking has not caused systematic or endemic problems with drinking water. So it's a regulatory scheme that's based on a misstatement of the facts, quite frankly. Now, the one thing we do know about federal regulation is when it's imposed, it always slows down exploration and production. 2010, federal lands produced 23% of the natural gas in this country. 2014, down to 13% at a time when there was enormous expansion going on elsewhere. That's what this is really aimed at, slowing down exploration and production, not at protecting drinking water. So in my view, this simply we shouldn't fund it, we shouldn't enforce it, and ultimately we should allow the states to regulate it. The other problem with this regime is in states that have large amounts of BLM land, you're literally going to have two systems under which you have to operate if you're an energy company. That's just enormously complex. It's a big mistake. There's no uniformity in it. That's not a big problem in my state. We don't have huge amounts of federal land, but we certainly have companies that are very active in western states that do, where the majority of their land is there. So you're literally, in a lot of these states, going to have one regulatory regime by people who, by the way, have been doing this stuff for years, because the department has not historically done this, and then another one on federal land. So I urge the adoption of the amendment.
Chairman Calvert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to thank my colleague, Representative Cole. He didn't have to offer this amendment, and I appreciate him doing it. I understand that BLM needed to update its regulations relating to fracking on federal and Indian lands, but because BLM regulations were 25, 30 years old. The states have done the same thing over the past several years. Unfortunately, BLM's rule that will go into effect next week is as duplicative, as Mr. Cole mentioned, of existing state regulation. It will force companies that drill on public land into a double compliance scheme, which was mentioned. What it will really cost them is time. It'll lengthen the time it takes to receive a permit. I talked to one small company, said what now takes several weeks could take as well over a year. It also that this isn't necessary. It would be great if the underlying statute were changed to allow BLM to delegate enforcement authority to the states, as was mentioned. Because the states have done a good job. There's study after study that shows that the states, kind of care about the land that they regulate. But until that occurs, the BLM changes course. I support this amendment to prohibit funding for BLM to implement this regulation. And one further comment. In Indian country, they've done a good job of regulating their own land. And this is an important resource to them. It's been able to, in many cases, bring them out of poverty. And then we're putting this regulation that will take them make them very uncompetitive in a very competitive world in the oil business. So I would certainly support Mr. Cole's amendment.
Ms. McCollum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as has been pointed out, prior to the issuance of hydraulic fracturing rule, the BLM's rules on oil and gas operations were last updated over 30 years ago. And they haven't kept pace with significant technology advances in hydraulic fracturing techniques and tremendous increase in its use. Because they haven't had the resources to do it, folks. They've been flat funded, and the only increase that they've gotten recently has been for sage-grouse protection. So I rise to oppose this amendment, and I would state this: as part of implementing its rule, The BLM state offices are in the process of meeting with their state counterparts to do exactly what Mr. Cole said, to undertake a state-by-state comparisons of regulatory requirements, to identify opportunities for variances and harmonization, to establish memorandums of understanding that will realize efficiencies and allow for successful implementation of the rule. So if we want BLM to be successful, we have to give them the resources they need to be successful. And if we want to have harmonization and cut down on the amount of people taking people to court, I think we should allow these memorandums of understanding with the BLM state offices to move forward. And for that reason, I oppose this amendment.
Mr. Farr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I regretfully have to oppose this amendment. First of all, on the premise that there's sort of a one-stop system here in almost all resource recovery if it's on federal lands or state lands. That's not true. There's a lot of states that haven't adopted any regulations on that. And as you know, in some of the states, the counties have adopted anti-fracking regulations, and there's been cases to overthrow those and make the, have the state law supreme to this. This is a very controversial area. It's an area that has all kinds of unintended consequences. You're pulling water, you're going to inject water in with the fracking material, which is a sand grit that keeps the pores opening so that you can frack and then get the oil out. And as far as resource extraction, we have different laws in timber harvesting on federal lands and federal forests than we have on state lands or private lands. And I think you're kind of choosing here that, well, we'll support local government when we like what local government does, and we won't support local government. And this one is you're essentially taking those federal lands, which aren't governed by the states. That's one of the problems. The state law doesn't cover those. I just found out that local law enforcement isn't even allowed to come in to my congressional office because it's in a post office building, and that's a federal building, and local law enforcement aren't allowed to come into federal buildings. So I think you may have some good intentions here, but I think your amendment is going to result in an awful lot of bad things happening. It's only the resource recovery people, the oil pit companies, that want this amendment. And I think those states that are affected by it won't have any controls over this would be injured, and that's essentially, in this very controversial area, we ought to let the law and resource management and resource recovery kind of work itself out. So it's not prohibited in California as a state, but there are a lot tougher standards to do fracking in California on their jurisdiction than it is on federal lands. And we would hope that the federal government would upgrade its fracking requirements.
Is there further discussion? If not, Mr. Cole is recognized to close.
I think, again, it's a matter simply of regulations being formulated on a problem that doesn't exist. The regulations are supposedly because we have a water quality problem. The EPA says, by and large, we don't. We'll have duplicative or competing standards, frankly, over large parts of the country. And if some of my friends suggest we want to have memorandum of agreements, that should be done before. You should not implement a regulatory system and then come out. I don't think that's the real aim here, quite frankly. Historically, again, states have done a very good job in this area. This is an area we, as a federal government, ought to be listening to what state regulators have been doing. We act as if fracking is a brand new process. Combined with horizontal drilling, it is, but it's over 60 years old. We've been fracking wells in Oklahoma for a long time, and they've been doing it in other parts of the country as well. It's not a new technology. And for those of you that have concerns about drinking water, the reality is we're drawing water from way below, thousands of feet below where we draw, and returning it there. Now, can there be mistakes in the handling of that? Sure, it certainly can be. If you don't cement and case your well properly, do those sorts of things, those things absolutely do occur. But this idea that there's some sort of broad water problem, just simply not the case. And anybody from an energy producing state can tell you that. So with that, I would urge the adoption of the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Question is on the Cole amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no.
No.
The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Mr. Kilmer.
Thank you, Chairman. I have an amendment.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr.
I ask
Kilmer.
that the amendment
Without
be
objection, the
considered.
reading is dispensed with. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by thanking the chairman and the ranking member and the majority and minority staff, and want to acknowledge, as Mr. Cole did earlier, the important work and progress that's been made on addressing the needs of Native American tribes. The gentleman was correct in saying that this committee has made progress on this front over the years. I actually represent, I have 12 tribes that live in and around the district that I represent. And as I go and visit reservations and meet with tribal councils, many of them are struggling just to get access to basic needs, decent housing, affordable health care, quality education. And I commend the chairman for taking the time to hear from the tribes. We had 2 days of testimony, and I think it highlighted many of the challenges that frankly aren't unique to my area. There are needs all around Indian country. And it's why I'm pleased to work with my colleagues, including several members of this committee, on updating the Quiet Crisis Report on federal funding and unmet needs in Indian country. Now, this administration put forward a strong budget for the federal government to continue to make progress in living up to its trust responsibilities and its treaty obligations. Today's bill does an admirable job of seeking to make the best of a bad hand, but for many tribes concerned about providing basic services to their members, I hope we can work together in a bipartisan fashion to do better. The amendment I'm offering would fully fund the Bureau of Indian Affairs to ensure that the federal government is strengthening the ability of tribal governments to exercise self-governance and self-determination, to improve opportunities for Native use, to boost education and access to broadband, and help support responsible and sustainable stewardship of trust assets. It would also provide full funding for the Indian Health Service, including to keep up with medical inflation, and $57 million to keep up simply with population growth. It ensured that we have the resources that tribes need to staff and operate tribal hospitals and health clinics, to increase access to dental health, and to support the proposed Tribal Behavioral Health Initiative. I recognize that we're under very tight caps, and I do, I believe some of my colleagues want to weigh in on this, but I do intend to withdraw the amendment. But I do think it's critical that we strengthen our investment in our tribes and help them meet their needs.
Chairman Calvert?
I must rise to oppose the amendment. I hope that when people look at this bill, they'll see that Indian country is a nonpartisan priority of this subcommittee. I certainly share the gentleman's desire that we do all we can for these important programs. I'm proud of what we did, given our 302B allocation. Without an offset, though, this amendment would breach the 302B allocation, would be subject to a point of order. We would not be able to take the bill to the House floor. With that said, I would ask my colleagues to oppose the amendment.
Ms. McCollum?
Mr. Chairman, I understand Mr. Kilmer is going to be withdrawing the amendment, but I would just like to point out that even when we're faced with a $250 million cut in the allocation from the Budget Committee to our full committee, Mr. Chairman, you prioritized and provided increases in this bill for BIA and IHS for Indian health, education, and safety in Indian country. So we do share that together as a common priority. And Mr. Chairman, I know you struggle to find these increases under a cap placed on this bill by the Republican budget. The fact that you could not go any farther is just proof that these caps need to go. The Native American communities that we work in partnership with need to be able to plan. They need to know that the critical support that they rely upon for the health and safety of their communities is going to be there. And it is also our responsibility, not only as a moral responsibility, but as something that we have been told and time again, at times from the courts, that we need to live up to our treaty rights and responsibilities. For that, I support the intent of the Kilmer Amendment, and I know that the gentleman will be withdrawing it.
Is there further discussion? Ms. Kilmer, you're recognized to close.
Thank you, Chairman. Again, I'd appreciate the opportunity to work with you and your staff going forward to ensure we continue to make progress on behalf of the profound needs in Indian country. And with that, I ask to withdraw the amendment.
Amendment is withdrawn. Ms. McCollum?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment.
Mike? Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Ms. McCollum. Page 26, line 24, reduce the dollar amount by $272 million. Page 28, lines 5
Mr.
through...
Chairman, I would agree
Without
that the...
objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Thank you,
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman. As Mr. Kilmer did, I intend to offer and withdraw this amendment, but I just want to point out to the full committee how we, in a bipartisan fashion, really struggled with the allocation that we had to do what we felt was right. What this amendment would do, it would remove contract support costs from the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Indian Health Services from the current annual appropriations process into a permanent and indefinite appropriations. Folks, we do this for all the other health care, Medicare, Medicaid. We do not annually have to have that come out of a committee's budget the way that the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Indian Health Services comes out of our budget. This change would provide tribes with the certainty that the United States government will honor its obligations, and where the Supreme Court has ruled on the issue. The Supreme Court has ruled that we have an obligation to reimburse these tribes for all costs under this program. This is not discretionary. We treat it like it's discretionary, but it is not discretionary, it's mandatory. So a more comprehensive approach would be for the authorizing committees to create a new standalone mandatory program that would provide the absolute certainty that the tribes deserve with respect to funding. Once again, I want to point out the great work that the chairman has done and what we've done together bipartisanly with the allocations in front of us. And I look forward to working with all the members of the subcommittee, the members of the full committee, and the authorizers to find a way to permanently ensure that we honor tribal self-governance contracts. And Mr. Chair, I know that you share many of these concerns. And before I withdraw the amendment, if the chairman would like to say anything.
If the gentlelady would yield.
Yes, I would yield.
Again, I respectfully oppose the amendment, but I certainly want to continue to work with you and other members of our committee. I think we've got a tradition, bipartisan, nonpartisan tradition, to make sure that we respect programs that support Indian health, Indian education, new school construction, and we'll continue to work together to do that. So I appreciate the gentlelady offering her amendment, and I appreciate the lady withdrawing that.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, just to summarize again, these are obligations and responsibilities that we have under treaty, under court, and everything that says that these are not discretionary funds, these are mandatory funds. And to place them in the Interior Sub-Appropriations Bill the way that they have been since the court had made these decisions is not a wise thing to do. It puts us at risk of not upholding, I believe, what our moral obligation, but what our legal obligation is, and it puts at risk so many of the other programs, the national parks, forests, and other things that we should be working on. And so I only bring this up not as a division between the chairman and I, but just as pleading with all of you that we need to move forward in a way that removes these as discretionary funds and makes them the mandatory funds they should be.
Will the gentlelady yield for a quick question?
I will if it's okay with the full committee chair.
The gentlelady's time is running short.
In that case, but I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Sorry.
Did you withdraw the amendment?
Mr. Chair, I was going to ask for unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment after Mr. Cole was done, but seeing as, and whatever you would say, I would agree with you wholeheartedly, Mr. Cole. I withdraw the amendment.
Amendment's withdrawn. Ms. Lowy.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, and I ask you that if it's
Amendment
consent
offered by
to
Mrs.
waive.
Lowy.
Objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would strike Section 428 from the bill, correct a misguided attack on our nation's clean air. Our priorities should be safeguarding our environment so that we can pass along to our children and grandchildren a better, cleaner planet. As currently written, this bill is nothing more than an attempt to protect dirty energy companies by prohibiting the president from instituting his planned regulations to limit greenhouse gas emissions. Air pollution associated with greenhouse gas emissions puts vulnerable populations at greater risk, including the elderly, children, and people suffering from respiratory illnesses. In my home state of New York, 10% of the adult population suffer from asthma. By supporting cleaner air, we're creating healthier cities that will enable people to lead more productive lives. We can no longer allow ourselves to be the hapless victims of climate change or those who choose to deny its existence. Climate and weather disasters in 2012 cost our economy more than $100 billion. Burying our head in the sand, ignoring reality, sacrifices the future of our children and grandchildren because we refuse to transition from outdated technologies that no longer serve us to those that will help grow the economy and create jobs. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment.
Chairman Calvert.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be quick on this. I know time is short, but the House has voted repeatedly to reject the administration's clear and prejudicial regulatory approach to coal. Further, the Supreme Court ruled that EPA does not have the authority to rewrite the Clean Air Act, as has been attempting to do, to make a square peg fit into a round hole, because the Clean Air Act was never intended to address carbon dioxide. The administration's policies, regulations, and rhetoric are all aimed at making energy more expensive in America, and this administration is marching toward changing the law of the land administratively, and will keep marching until it meets resistance. That's why this language is in the bill and will remain in this bill. I would urge a no vote on this amendment to strike.
I'm also opposed to this amendment. EPA has been dismantling the coal industry piece by piece with its regulatory agenda for years. The uncertainty created by the recent onslaught of environmental regulations has made it nearly impossible to do business. And we're feeling the impact of these policies in my district in Appalachia. I've had over 9,000 miners laid off just since the president took office. In fact, we've lost over 45,000 good-paying mining jobs in the country just in the last 4 years. That's almost 1/3 of the mining jobs nationwide. If the administration is allowed to move forward with its strict emission standards on new and existing power plants, we're going to see more of these staggering job losses in the coal mining community, and I would say to you, in areas that border on mining communities. More job losses, mine closures throughout the country means higher energy prices for the American consumer. So I urge a no vote on this amendment. Ms. McCollum.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the Lowy Amendment. And I hear what you're saying about the loss of jobs, and any of us who have gone through a plant closing or restructuring or you know, the Great Recession that we just went through, we mourn the loss of hardworking families losing their jobs. And the fact that coal is now competing toe-to-toe with natural gas and, you know, changing the way that even power plants in my district have restructured because of the cost of natural gas. You know, for that, I know that some of your constituents are facing some very hard times. But the effects of climate change are real, and they're being felt by Americans every day. According to NASA, climate change is causing droughts and increasing forest fire frequency in the West, flooding in the Midwest, and declining water supplies in the Southeast. This administration has proposed a clean power plant rule using the authority granted under the Clean Air Act to develop the first ever carbon pollution standards for existing power plants. These standards will protect the health of our children and put our nation on the path towards 30% reduction of carbon pollution. I believe we must take action on climate change. It is the right thing to do, not only for us here today, but it's the right thing to do for our children and our children's children, in order for them to have a planet in which they can live a happy, healthy, productive life with clean air and clean water. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Is there further discussion? If not, Ms. Lowy is recognized to close.
I urge the committee to adopt my amendment after allowing utilities enough time to make changes without affecting reliability. By 2030, the EPA's proposed guidelines for existing power plants would deliver $55 to $93 billion in net benefits from reducing carbon pollution and other harmful pollutants, and shrink electricity bills by roughly 8%.
The question is on the Lowy amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. No. The noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to. Recorded vote is requested. Sufficient number supporting. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop.
No.
Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert.
No.
Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson. Ms. DeLauro. Mr. Dent. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr. Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah. Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Fillingheisen. Mr. Fillingheisen, no. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Hero Butler. Ms. Hero Butler. Ms. Hero Butler, no. Mr. Honda. Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Israel. Aye. Mr. Israel, aye. Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, no. Mr. Jolly. Mr. Jolly, no. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter. Aye. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy.
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCollum.
Aye.
Ms. McCollum, aye. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo, no. Ms. Pingree.
Aye.
Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mr. Ridgel. Mr. Ridgel, no. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo Allard. Ms. Robo Allard, aye. Mr. Ruppersberger. Mr. Ruppersberger, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Vyskowski. Mr. Vyskowski, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Aye.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded?
Mr. Lauro.
Mr. Culberson.
Mr. Culberson, no. Mr. Lauro.
Mr. Laurel.
Mr. Lauro, aye.
Mr. Vyskowski, have you decided? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 19, the nays are 32. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Israel.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Amendment offered by Mr. Israel.
Clerk will read.
Ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to be very brief. I will offer and then withdraw this amendment. This amendment increases funding in two areas. One, for the Long Island Sound, which is a precious environmental and economic resource in the country. 9 million Americans live in the Long Island Sound watershed. 23 million live within 50 miles. The other area of funding increase is for a critically important program by the National Endowment for the Arts. Mr. Chairman, I would commend to the attention of my colleagues this extraordinary book called Operation Homecoming, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Home Front in the words of U.S. troops and their families. This was a result of a public-private partnership between the Boeing Corporation and the National Endowment for the Arts. What we are learning is that writing therapies are very effective in addressing and mitigating PTSD and mild traumatic brain injury. Many veterans are coming home with PTSD. We all know the suicide rate. We all know how massive this problem is. And writing is helping to alleviate the symptoms of PTSD. The NEA is trying this on a limited basis. I learned about this and had hoped that they would be able to scale this up at VA hospitals and other sites across the country. They can't do it without the appropriate resources, and so I had requested some additional funds. I look forward to working with Chairman Calvert to see if we can find those resources in the weeks and months ahead to make this not just one experiment, but a very important therapy for PTSD for veterans throughout the country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Calvert.
I appreciate the gentleman's interest in boosting funds for other accounts. that are of interest to him, but I must remind the gentleman the offset he proposes we can't accept. But in any case, I fully committed to working with you and both sides of the aisle as we move this bill forward to the legislative process. And again, thank you, and thank you for withdrawing the bill.
Gentleman, withdraw the amendment.
Can I just quickly?
Gentlelady's recognized.
All right, I know we're short on time. I just wanted to thank my colleague for introducing this amendment, in particular the program that he spoke briefly about. The NEH in my state has been able to fund a program through the Maine Humanity Council, which has brought veterans together for reading and discussion and has been very critical and helpful in many of the issues that you mentioned. This funding that you had requested would really have offered that opportunity to many other states. I think the way you're funding this is perfectly fine. We should ask the oil and gas industry to pay for their own inspections. And I just wanted to stand in support of this and hope that we can find a way to get the funding for this eventually.
Mr. Chairman, I want to weigh in also in favor of this amendment, and while we're recommending reading, I would recommend the report of the National Commission on the Humanities called The Heart of the Matter. And there you'll find a discussion of the critical importance of the humanities to our whole educational system, not in some kind of truth and beauty sense, although there's nothing wrong with truth and beauty. There are many more practical ways that the arts, humanities, social sciences teach essential skills: reading, writing, critical thinking, effective communication. These are relevant to every individual. So we're funding the humanities endowment and the arts endowment at levels way beyond their way below their historical level. If the 1992 budget remained constant, only adjusted for inflation, these agencies would be funded at $289 million today. That's almost twice what's in this bill. So I appreciate the gentleman calling our attention to this deficiency and would support his amendment.
Mr. Laurel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I rise in support of the amendment. I'm supportive of the efforts for the NEA and the National Endowment and the National Endowment for the Humanities. But as co-chair of the Long Island Sound Caucus with my colleague, Mr. Israel, I know firsthand how much the Long Island Sound means to the people of New England and to eastern New York. It is not just a place for recreation, which is wonderful, or nature and beauty, but it is really a commercial area for shell fishermen, commercial fishermen, and where people really, their livelihoods are at stake. It's a vast watershed, 17,000 square miles. It cuts across 6 states. An area that includes 650,000 acres of some of our nation's most important farmland. And activity on the land as far north as northern New Hampshire and Vermont can put runoff in rivers and streams that flow down through Massachusetts and through Connecticut and out into the Sound. Runoff can have a severe effect on species like the American shad, the American eel, river herring, and even on the entire ecosystem. So in addition to protecting a natural world, we know that conservation projects create jobs. In 2013, they supported 660,000 jobs directly and many more indirectly in tourism and recreation. So it's environmentalism and economic growth are not an either-or proposition. The work that's been done already to restore and to preserve the Sound makes a difference. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Thank you.
Mr. Israel is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to working with the subcommittee chairman to see if we can find appropriate sources to fund these priorities and acceptable offsets, and I withdraw the amendment.
It's withdrawn. Mr. Valadeo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Valadeo.
Yes, the reading is
Without
dispensed with.
objection, the reading is dispensed with.
This is a simple amendment. I know everybody here has heard about what's going on in California with the drought and what we're facing there. There's a piece of, there is language in the law, there's supposed to be a study done every 5 years to update us here in Congress on what's going on at the Delta smelt. They have not started that study, and so all my amendment does is start that study and have it done, because it is due this year, on what the current status is with the Delta smelt, and so that when we make decisions going forward on how to treat the species and how to adjust flows and everything so that we can get some water to the valley, we have some actual information at our hands.
Chairman Calvert.
Certainly rise in support of this amendment, certainly echoing Mr. Valadeo's comments. it's extremely important that the EPA and, or whatever agencies involved to do these 5-year reviews on time. This is Fish and Wildlife. And many times the agencies do not do that, and so in this case, when we're in a critical situation such as this, these factors are extremely important. We'd like to make sure that these studies are done in a timely fashion. I don't think this is controversial. We cannot expect to restore the smelt species by relying solely on flushing massive amounts of fresh water in the ocean. We have to look at other impacts that are going on in the Bay Delta area, and so I certainly would urge my colleagues to adopt this amendment and follow the law. That's what we're asking to do. Thank you.
Mr. Honda?
Thank you. I rise to support this amendment. The Delta smelt is not only a fish, but it's also a biological marker to tell us the health of the Delta. And the health of the Delta is impacted by agriculture, fishermen, the extraction of water to the south. It's a multiplicity of impacts on the Delta and its health. And I think that the Delta smelt is one of those indicators that we need to look at. And I look forward to seeing the data that supports the impact of the Delta smelt. So I support this amendment. It's a good one.
Is there further discussion? If not, Mr. Valadeo is recognized to close.
Sounds like bipartisan support, so I'll end with, I ask for an aye vote. Thank you, sir.
Good speech. Questions on Valadeo's amendment? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. Ayes have it. The amendment's agreed to. Let me announce a schedule change for tomorrow morning. The full committee meeting on financial services will now start at 11 instead of 10, as originally scheduled. This will let us do the Labor, Health, and Human Services Subcommittee markup, and so I thank the members for letting us change the schedule. Are there other amendments? If not, the chair recognizes the gentleman, the chairman of the Defense Subcommittee, Mr. Freeling.
Mr. Chairman, I move to favorably report the Interior and Environmental Appropriations Bill for fiscal year 2016 to the House.
Question is on the motion. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. A roll call is requested. Sufficient number. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert. Aye. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Crenshaw, aye. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, aye. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Dent. Mr. Dent, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Farr. Mr. Farr, no. Mr. Fatah. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, aye. Mr. Frelinghuysen. Mr. Frelinghuysen, aye. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, aye. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler, aye. Mr. Honda. Mr. Honda, no. Mr. Israel. Mr. Israel, no. Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Jolly. Mr. Jolly, aye. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, no. Mrs. Lowy? No. Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCullum? No. Ms. McCullum, no. Mr. Palazzo? Mr. Palazzo? Mr. Palazzo, aye. Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, no. Mr. Ridgel? Mr. Ridgel, aye. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, aye. Mr. Rogers?
Aye.
Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, aye. Ms. Rowe-Ballard? Ms. Rowe-Ballard, no. Mr. Rupersberger? Mr. Rupersberger, no. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, no. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano, no. Mr. Simpson? Simpson? Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, aye. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Visclosky? Mr. Visclosky, no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye.
Other members who wish to be recorded, Mr. Fatah.
Mr. Fatah. Mr. Fatah, no.
Members wish to change their vote. Clerk will tally.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. What a great bill.
Good work. On this vote, the yeas are 30, the nays are 21. The motion is agreed to. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be given the authority to make technical and conforming changes to the items approved today. With that objection so ordered, 3 days are granted. If there's no further business, the committee stands adjourned.